Good afternoon. I'm calling the Board of Directors meeting to order and this is a specific agenda, as all of you are aware, and it is Wednesday, June 8th at exactly 1 p.m. Before we begin today's hearing, I'd like to take a little bit of chair's prerogative, because I know that the members of the board would like to acknowledge him, and that's Mike McGring. Where are you, Mike? There he is. Members, Mike will be retiring as of today, and he is going to leave us with a big puka, bigger puka than Brennan's potholes that he only can use 3 of. Mike, thank you very much, and thank you so very much for all your service. Thank you. Members of the public, as well as board members, given the nature of today's presentation from the staff, I would like to request your cooperation in being able to hold public testimony and questions by the board until after the presentation. And as we go through it, I think you will see the value of doing that. However, if there's anyone, I know Barbara Armitrott has requested that we do that. If there's anybody, because of time or anything, that needs to testify now, please let me know, step forward. If not, I'm going to assume that everyone will wait till after the presentation, and once we go through it, I believe that you'll understand why. Yes, did somebody raise their hand that they wanted? No? Shannon, did you want to testify now, or are you just waving to someone? No? Okay. So with that, since we do not, members, have a voting quorum here, I am going to bypass that and we're going to bypass the approval of the minutes and defer that to the end of the agenda. So let's go to agenda item 4, discussion of the options to HART's current full funding grant agreement. And before we begin with Brennan, does Dan, would you like to put this into context? Because what the public may not be aware of, and I hope all board members do have copies of this, is that on June 6th, you received a letter from the United States Department of Transportation, the Federal Transit Administration, regarding a recovery plan. So if you would like to give this as the backdrop as to why we are going with this presentation.
Sure.
Dan.
Thank you, Chair Hanabusa, members of the board and the public. We did receive, as expected, a letter from the Federal Transit Administration this week that requires us to put together what's called a recovery plan. As a result of the recent risk refresh of our budget and schedule that the FTA conducted, it was determined that the funds we have available to complete the project are insufficient, and that the time to complete the project is likely longer than had been previously anticipated. As a result of that, there is a mechanism that the FTA can engage in, which is called a recovery plan for various entities that are in a similar situation. And in the most basic terms, what the recovery plan does is to identify any shortfall in the budget and then ask the individual recipient, in this case the City and County of Honolulu, of federal grants, to come up with scenarios that will be discussed with the Federal Transit Administration to either shorten or limit the actual full funding grant project as it was described in that document. What Brennan Morioka, Sam Carnaggio, our project director, and a number of the staff have been working on is an initial take on what various scenarios might look like. They've also included scenarios that have been proposed by various individuals that HART should look at in terms of what the project might look like if we were to build to the budget. And then at the very beginning, Brendan, I think will outline for everybody sort of how we got here and what the gap is. And we've been calling it internally sort of, Plan A and Plan B, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Plan A is to identify what the shortfall is and to have a public discussion about whether or not additional revenues can be found to make up that gap. The second half and the bulk of the presentation really focuses on if we were to build only with the available funds we have today, what might those scenarios look like? And so this is intended to be informational and exchange of ideas. And in the letter that we received from the FTA, they've requested that over the next couple of months that we produce a report to them or a recovery plan that would be what we would propose. I might parenthetically say that I think that's a little bit short in terms of the time frame we need. I've already reached out to Leslie Rogers, the Region 9 administrator, because I think we may need a little more time just given the constraints that we have to deal with all of our various partners. But that being said, the goal is to come to some consensus, go to the Federal Transit Administration, and seek from them their guidance and cooperation to, if we need to size the project to meet our current projected budget.
I know that Member Louis Kwan has a specific question to you, but just so that the public is aware that the letter sets a deadline of on or before August 7th.
That's correct.
As the time to come up with the recovery plan. And Member Louis Kwan is going to just follow up on that shortly.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Dan, we've been told consistently by the FTA that the project, as determined to be 20 miles, 21 stations, was non-modifiable.
That's correct.
Under the full funding grant agreement. Does this request by the FDA indicate that they're willing to deviate from that plan that's been laid out in the full funding grant agreement?
It does. What has been communicated to us is that I think there's been a recognition that we had identified a shortfall previously, and that the city and county made an attempt to try to make up that shortfall in good faith and came up with a 5-year extension of the general excise tax. However, because of the continued escalating costs here on the island, I think they recognize that that is likely now the costs have outstripped even that additional 5-year extension. And so for the first time in my time with the project, I would tell you that the FTA has had a complete turnabout and have said to us that they are looking to work with us to size the project to the available budget with the goals that were still embedded in the FFGA, meaning we had a projected ridership of now about 119,000 riders. We wanted to have certain positive transit benefits that would be purchased by the $1.55 billion from the federal government and the local money. And what the challenge we have now is, and basically what they've said to us is this: how close can you get to that original commitment with the money you have? And if we can come close enough, then they've indicated to us that not only would they be amenable to changing the full funding grant agreement to amend it, but that they would also leave the full $1.55 billion commitment on the table to us. Because I know another question that had been asked in the past is, if we didn't build everything, might they take all or some of the money back? And the second important point that they've made is that the resources that they've pledged, if they approve this revised project, would be fully pledged to the project.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And just so that we all understand, when the executive director spoke of the FTA raising this in the past, it was actually in August of 2014 that the FTA actually raised it in an August refresh, budget refresh, I believe. And at that time, they had said that this project may be in a recovery mode as well. But because of the GET extension, that was deferred, and now we are here, notwithstanding. So with that, members, we're going to continue. And for those of you who are coming in now, What we have decided to do, and we've asked the cooperation of both the public testifiers that are here as well as the board members, is to permit Brennan Morioka to go through the whole presentation, because I believe that once you all see it, it may affect the way you might think about coming forward to testify, and it will also affect the board members as well. So, Mr. Morioka.
Thank you, Chair Hanabusa, members of the board, Brennan Morioka on behalf of HART. As Dan mentioned, what this presentation is intended on doing is, number one, provide a very quick historical perspective on the last few years of the project, and some general background information that we think is important as a part of this discussion. And then I'm going to go into some various options, or a discussion of various options that either have been mentioned or raised, and then we're going to lay some of the groundwork for what that would entail, some of the pros and cons, and then one of the options is what we're calling an a la carte exercise. And I think it'll become fairly evident that that exercise is going to be the primary focus moving forward on how we look at what we can and cannot afford in terms of completing this project, or building a facility or a system that is a functional system. And so always just kind of put the parameters out there. Our current project is a 20-mile elevated guideway system with 21 stations from East Kapolei all the way to Ala Moana Center. And then just some history. In December of 2012, HART and the city entered into a full funding grant agreement for a total project cost of $5.122 billion, with a federal contribution of $1.55 billion, with a revenue service date of January 31st of 2020. Just a very general description of what the project is that it is a 20-mile elevated guideway fixed rail system from East Kapolei to Ala Moana, with the various stops, including University of Hawaii, West Oahu, Pearl Harbor, Honolulu International Airport, and then ultimately to Ala Moana Shopping Center, except for a portion, a 0.6-mile portion of at-grade section at Leeward Community College, which goes through our rail operations center. Project includes 21 stations, 80 rail vehicles, and a maintenance and storage facility, which we are now calling the Rail Operations Center. In September of 2012, prior to entering into the FFGA, the FTA did a risk and contingency review and did concur with the acceptability of the $5.122 billion budget, and which also included a $644 million total contingency. Since then, HART has continued to work closely with the FTA and its project management oversight contractor, or the PMOC. We do meet with them monthly, of which we've been meeting with them this week. And we do continue with quarterly reviews by the FTA's regional office every three months. In August of 2014, the FTA did a risk refresh exercise, at which point they did recommend that HART increase our cost estimate to $5.4 billion by adding $265 million of additional costs between adjustments and additional contingency. However, subsequent to that, we did open the bids for the 9 West Station groups, in which I believe FTA, PMO, as well as HART, as well as many others, were surprised at the significant increase in costs at which our construction pricing was coming in, and the increases in construction costs over the last 5 years. And then most recently, May 10th, 2016, FTA did forward a copy of their most recent risk refresh, which began in March of this year, in which they stated HART's costs should be increased to $7.7 billion at their 50% probability level, with $856 million in contingency, or at their P65, or a 65% confidence level, a estimated budget of about $8.0 billion, which included a $1.1 billion level of contingency. So with that, HART also has been working on our own independent estimates to redevelop our budget as a part of our financial plan resubmittal to the FTA. We are still working on it, but in trying to provide some level of estimates at this point in time, our current estimate is about $7.97 billion for a total program cost. Our projected schedule estimates an April of 2024 construction completion timeframe with a revenue service date of December of 2024, which is approximately the same as what the FTA came out with as well. I would note that the FTA came out with a variety of confidence levels. They're 50% confidence as well as a 65% confidence. What we are providing here is not a probability number because the method in which the FTA did their exercise is slightly different. They do it from what's called a top-down estimation, and they go through a Monte Carlo simulation to develop or to assess the value of different risk levels. We are in the process of doing that right now, and we'll be working with FTA in negotiating all of our assumptions compared to theirs. But this number reflects what we call a bottoms-up estimate, where we estimate things from a basic level, and then we start assigning certain risk values or contingency levels. And so this does include approximately 15% contingency on the remaining contract values, as well as adding 15% of additional contingency onto some of the remaining work on the west side, or the first 10 miles. 15. Yes. Yeah. So on the converse side, we were just talking about costs. Now we need to look at the revenue side, and our projected revenue resources total $6.8 billion. Of which, if you look at a breakdown, the GET revenues we are currently projecting at a little bit under $5 billion, and that's based on a 4.3% growth rate of the GET over a period of time through 2022. We do provide a slight range between a 4% growth rate and a 5.04% growth rate, which was the original assumption in the FFGA's financial plan. That $6.8 billion number also includes the $1.55 billion in federal grant, as well as a $0.3 billion initial balance that we started the FFGA with. So just to give a little background as well, and perspective on what we're looking at when we start talking about deferral or deletion of stations or aspects of our rail system, which is going to become the exercise that we will have to go through as a part of the recovery plan that Dan had mentioned. This is just a chart showing the estimated daily boardings, looking at a projected time frame of 2030 when we would be in full operation, just to kind of give you a perspective on where the different stations lie in terms of where people are going to be looking to enter into and onto the rail system. And then just and just to note that this is an updated, so it's not exactly what was in the FFGA or our previous documents, because we did do an update to our estimated ridership estimates when we converted from a two-train system or two-train car to a four-car train configuration. So this is an updated number. It's not going to match some of the older numbers that we have in some of our documents. And then this is just a different view of the same estimated daily boardings, but it kind of gives you a perspective also on how people will, what we anticipate how people will get to the stations, whether they're walking or biking, riding the bus, or driving there. So looking at projected costs versus projected revenue, which is the issue that we are facing right now, given that we are projecting a cost of $7.97 billion and the projected revenue of $6.8 billion, we do have an estimated potential deficit of about $1.14 billion. And without additional revenue, which is the assumption that we need to operate under in terms of council's request currently in terms of the limitations of the use of the GET, as well as FTA's request in terms of showing what we could potentially build based on the budget, which is why we have started to discuss building to budget versus budgeting to what we would like to build. So the remainder of the presentation is going to basically focus on these 6 different concepts. It's really 5, but there, as you can see, our second concept does have a modification to it. And so it's build to Middle Street, and then build to Middle Street as planned, which includes all of the stations and the Pearl Highlands Garage, up to Middle Street, which is the airport guideway and station contract. And then from there on, build only the guideway with no stations to Ala Moana Shopping Center, where we will build the Ala Moana station, which is the terminus station. Option 2, which we have 2 different versions, is build to Middle Street as planned, and then continue from there with bus service or some form of bus service, whether it's what we currently have or a form of BRT, or build to Middle Street as planned and then continue with an at-grade rail system. Primarily, it would be looked at as a light rail system at grade. Option 3 is to construct as far, or look at the different options of constructing as far as we can, as far as funding allows, but looking at it through a a la carte menu per se, this will kind of become evident as we go through this option when I explain all the different choices that we could potentially make. And option 4 is to not build any of the stations as a part of our HART's contracts, but to put them out as public-private partnership solicitations at all 21 stations, or a combination. And then the 5th one is to change the alignment from Dillingham to Nimitz Highway, and then hook back up in the Ivaley downtown area. Okay, so getting right into the options. So the first option, option 1, build to Middle Street as planned, build the guideway only, without any stations to Ala Moana. And so for each of our options, we do have a very general description of the changes, right? So build the guideway only with no stations from Middle Street to Ala Moana, and then do not build any stations beyond Middle Street except for the Ala Moana terminus station. So just visually, this is where we would be ending, at the Middle Street Transit Center location. We have a station that's coming over, crossing over Nimitz Highway and Kamehameha Highway, hooking up with a pedestrian bridge to the Middle Street Transit site. So and we're going to be using this illustration for consistency, just to kind of give you a constant perspective of what the different options will look like. The blue is the guideway itself, and then the little dots are the stations, and the stations that we would consider building are going to be labeled in black, and then the ones that will not be built as a part of that option are listed in in gray, but we do provide it to you so that you can see where they are in terms of the alignment and what is going to not be included. And so as you can see here, the guideway in blue is being built from Middle Street to Ala Moana Center, with all of the intermediate stations being deferred. So some of the pros and cons for each of the options. So option 1, this does save on the initial costs of building the 7 stations, because we are building the last Ala Moana one. Construction impact will temporarily be lessened because of the deferral of the station construction. And then we would be able to look or consider a reduction in the number of rail cars that are purchased, but we would not fully recoup all of those costs, not for a dollar-for-dollar basis, because we are already in a contract. And so you don't get your full dollar-for-dollar back in a de-scoping of an existing contract. But what this does do also is it preserves the guideway corridor, because the guideway will have already been built. Some of the cons is that the deferral of stations will significantly impact ridership. We would have to come back and do, and for each of these options, we would be doing complete ridership reevaluations to firmly understand where people will be coming from and what those impacts might be. We would expect a loss in ridership by many of these changes. We would be looking at an increased final cost to build the remainder of the stations later on, because construction costs will continue to escalate over time, maybe not at the same pace that it currently is escalating, but even though we go through our construction cycles, construction costs do continue to escalate. And so final costs will likely be higher than it is today. And then increased costs to buy the remainder of the rail cars, primarily due to economies of scale, because we would be probably entering into a new contract to purchase the additional cars. No significant savings on time, because the primary part of this area for construction is on the guideway, the shafts, the columns, and the guideway itself, because much of the station work can be done concurrently, or it would be slightly afterwards. So the overall schedule would not be significantly reduced. And then you would, during this period of time, with no stations in between, you would not have rail service to Kalihi downtown or Kaka'ako, which goes to the ridership issues. And then we would have to look at significant changes to many of our existing contracts. And the biggest thing is, even though we would build the guideway only, no stations except for the terminus, we are still short of funds. This option would cost approximately $7.59 billion or more. Option 2 is build to Middle Street as planned, with all the stations and parking rides and parking garage up to Middle Street, and continue from that point on with bus service. So the description terminates the elevated rail system after the Middle Street Transit Center station. We would still need to install a crossover after the station. Crossover is basically an extension of the guideway so that we can have the ability to allow the rail cars to cross over to the different side of the rail lines, right? On top of our guideway, we have two sets of tracks, one going townbound, one going outbound to the west. And so we need to be able to have the ability to get the rail cars back onto the other side to go back in the other direction. So that's what the crossover is. And you'll see the mention of this crossover on a numerous times, because anytime we're going to be ending other than Ala Moana, where we do have a planned crossover with the tail track, we do have to continue to install this crossover, which does not currently exist at many of these other stations that could potentially be a terminus. We would have to initialize further integration with bus transit center. We would have to redo our bus integration plan and work with DTS and OTS on all the different bus routes that would have to be entertained in order to get people from Middle Street Transit Center to all the various destinations that they're going to want to continue to go. And then there are certain core system aspects, as well as other parts of the guideway and powering components, like the TPSS, which is a traction power substation. It's different substations spread along the 20 miles that provides power into our rail system for the third rail to power the rail cars along the guideway, rather than just putting all of the electricity into the system at one point. So it is a distributive system in getting the electricity into the entire 20-mile system. So we would have to look at many of these changes, which would also come at a cost for redesigning a lot of it. And then we'd have to construct kiss and ride additional kiss and ride facilities to accommodate this plan. Just visually, we would end the guideway at Middle Street and then somehow get people to their various destinations through the course of the corridor. Pros and cons, very similar. We would be saving some of the initial upfront costs, but when you look at the cons, we do have additional costs or higher costs to build some of those stations and guideway later on or after the fact if we choose to continue the project as planned. Construction impacts will temporarily be lessened by deferral of stations and the guideway, and then we could have the potential, and we would likely actually reduce the number of rail cars if we were to terminate at Middle Street. And then some of the cons would be that the change in travel mode does discourage ridership, having to get on. Maybe if someone is traveling from bus to get onto the rail and then only traveling to Middle Street, they would have to then get back onto bus or another form of transportation. The multiple changes in transportation mode is a discouragement to rail ridership. So we would probably see a significant drop in projected ridership. Also requires more bus integration and increased bus service and costs, because now there would be a greater strain on the bus system to finish that final leg of people's travels. Increased costs of right-of-way for acquisition at a later date, and then additional costs due to infrastructure changes or core system changes, and then increased costs to build the remainder of the stations and the guideway and buy rail cars, all at a later date. Option 2A, basically the same, is end at Middle Street as planned, but continue with some form of at-grade rail system, more than likely a light rail system. Very similar, terminates elevated rail system, install crossover after the station. Possible need for a supplemental EIS for the change in technology to go from steel on steel elevated guideway to a at-grade light rail system, which would cause time because we would not be able to proceed with that option until all of our environmental clearances are done. Again, working with the bus and the light rail system on that form of integration from the Middle Street Transit Center, and then acquire land and design and construct new light rail operations and maintenance facility. That is probably one of the bigger challenges, because we would need a entirely separate maintenance facility, much like we have at the Rail Operations Center at Leeward Community College, but we would have to find some place, probably on the order of 30 to 40 acres of land in the downtown urban core, in order to accommodate the rail vehicles that we would have. And then design and construct alignment for the light rail, including overhead electrical catenary system, much like you see in San Francisco for the Muni or in Seattle for their light rail system. And then we'd have to do much of the same things in moving our traction power substations and other core system changes. Again, visual on where the guideway would terminate, and then dashed arrow on how people would have to find a different way to get into their final destination. Pros and cons, very similar between the two. Option 3, which is constructing the project as far as funding allows, which we are calling an a la carte evaluation. What is provided in this presentation that will be further developed as we discuss it with a working group or our HART board or anyone else that is a part of the decision-making process on what the final outcome is on the facility that we're going to choose to build. We have developed costs or estimated costs, very high-level estimations of what it would cost to terminate at each of the different stations, assuming that everything else behind it has been built. So all the stations behind it, the parking garage, the park and rides, and then there's also an itemized chart on each of the different stations with estimated costs or actual costs for the station, all 21 stations and the Pearl Highlands parking garage, that you can kind of pick and choose and just go through this exercise. These numbers are not fully accurate because as I go through it, there are many things in these numbers that will still have to be built as a part of various choices, and so this is just for discussion purposes only, to show you how the exercise would work. As we start to narrow down some of the choices, we will refine those actual costs as well as go through ridership evaluations for the various selected scenarios so that people understand what those consequences are, because for any decision that we're going to make, whether we defer a specific station or other things or other aspects, each of those decisions are going to have various impacts to what was originally planned, now that we're going to start changing various components. So just to kind of give you a chart version of the breakdown of the different costs if we were to stop the guideway at each of the stations. So If we were to stop the project at Middle Street, it would cost approximately $6.22 billion if we were not to continue the guideway from that point forward. And just remember, that does not include any of the additional costs that bus or other types of changes that would have to be made. So there would be additional costs to the $6.22 billion of the Middle Street termination. And then there's just the various other estimates at the various stations if we were to continue the project to the various stations. And again, this is assuming that we build all the stations and everything else up to that point. And then this is just a graphical illustration of the stations with their estimated costs. And then this is the 22 different things, the 21 different stations plus the Pearl Highlands Transit Center. And their estimated values, or in terms of the 9 west stations, they are the actual costs that we broke down in the bids. But I do definitely want to point out that although our exercise that I'm going to discuss is basically taking various options and taking this as a dollar for dollar subtraction from that example, we are not going to get a dollar for dollar savings on any of these options, right? For those that we already have contracted, we have contracts, there are terms in the contracts. If we were to de-scope any of these existing stations from existing contracts, we are not going to get dollar for dollar value. Maybe you could look at anywhere from 50 to 70% back on a dollar. For those that we don't have procured, again, there are various components, traction powers, substations, train control systems, crossovers, numerous other things that are a part of these station costs that have not yet been broken out. And it would really depend on where you would terminate the guideway, that we would have to relook at where we would have to reposition many of these things. So some of these costs from stations that could be deferred would still probably have to be carried. So you will see in the exercise that I'm going to give you a number, but it's really, that is probably what, I mean, that's the arithmetic number that it's going to be, but it's probably going to be more. Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 a la carte examples, and these, and please keep in mind, we are not making any recommendations as a part of this presentation. This is just for illustrative purposes only, to show how the a la carte exercise would work. So if we were to just say, let's build to Ivaley Station and build everything to that point, then that is about a $7.15 billion cost. But I have that plus because it will probably be more, because there are aspects at some of the stations that are east of Ivaley that will still probably have to be carried and incorporated as a part of this project. If we were to look at another example, let's just say we want to go down to downtown station at Aloha Tower, but we want to eliminate the Kalihi, Kapalama, and Chinatown stations as deferrals as a part of this decision and just build the Ivaley station. You would take the downtown number, which is at a certain level, and then subtract out the Chinatown, Kapalama, and Kalihi values, and that's how we come up with the $7.35 billion number to get to downtown terminus. But again, there are probably aspects in many of the other stations that would have to be incorporated. So this is probably a low-end number, and it's probably going to be higher than that. But this just kind of gives you an example of how we would start the exercise and coming down with, okay, what do we where do we want to go, and what do we want the remainder of it to look like? 2 more examples. If we were to end at Civic Center terminus on South Street, continue to defer the Kalihi, Kapalama, and Chinatown stations, but build the Ivaley and downtown and Civic Center stations, you're looking at about $7.5 billion or more. And then if we were to build all the way to Ala Moana Center as the terminus, but delete many of the other stations, just keeping in Ivaley and downtown, defer Civic Center, Kaka'ako, Chinatown, Kapalama, and Kalihi, we'd be looking at about a $7.8 or more billion effort. So option 3, which is the a la carte evaluation method, Obviously, it provides decision makers with the maximum flexibility in the use of current funding because it provides you with the ability to make a number of different choices based on a myriad of scenarios. You would save on the initial costs again because you would be reducing scope, but at the end of the day, if we do plan on continuing to build the full 20 miles and 21 stations, we would be paying a higher cost in the future, at whatever point that would be, because those construction costs would be escalating over time. Construction impacts would be lessened because of the deferral of stations and parts of the guideway, and we could look at reduction in the number of initial rail cars as a part of our purchase. Some of the cons is, again, change of travel modes discourages ridership, depending on where that you would terminate the guideway system, requires more bus integration and puts stress again on the bus service. And then you would increase costs to build the remainder of the guideway and stations at a later date, as well as buying more rail cars.
And Brennan, although we didn't put an example in the PowerPoint, Brennan mentioned earlier that this a la carte option could also extend to stations between East Kapolei and Middle Street. So in other words, we have priced out those additional stations, and even though some of them have even begun construction, we have not yet awarded the 4 stations in the airport section. Those could also be mixed and matched, so to say, to meet a budget if you wanted to extend the guideway further, but delete other stations.
Right, which is why on that chart of all the stations, we do provide all 21 stations because although we do have existing contracts, they are not yet built. Some have already started some of the initial construction, but they are not yet built. So there is still that opportunity if we make those decisions fairly quickly on deleting some of those stations at this point in time. Option 4 is issue public-private partnerships or solicitations for all 21 stations. This would reduce initial HART capital investments and attempt to get more buy-in from developers to build around those stations. But it would also require a number of change orders to existing contracts and in some of the initial projects, as well as some of the future ones that we're in current procurement on as well. Just a visual on where the stations are. This is only the city center portion. We would apply this to all 21 stations though, or at least this concept for discussion. And again, this could be, this option as well as options 1 and 2 can be accommodated for in the a la carte evaluation, right? Because it's just a matter of doing the math on all these different options. Some of the pros and cons, P3 solicitations might result in lower costs for some stations because typically when the private sector does construction for the same type of work, private sector can often get lower prices than government owners. But it would also require us from adjusting or amending many of our existing contracts, causing defaults by HART on our contracts, impact some of the timing for our new solicitations, including airport and city center, as well as introduces some uncertainty of timing for the availability of those stations, because then it would become contingent upon the timing of a developer to be able to pay and build or afford and build these stations. And this would require approximately $900 million, over $900 million in private capital to build all 21 stations. And then the final option is to relook at the alignment, taking it away from Dillingham because of some of the concerns of the utility work that has to be done to accommodate the guideway down Dillingham and moving it into Nimitz. So basically bypassing Dillingham by going onto Nimitz Highway and connecting back to our originally planned route back in Ivalais, or probably closer to the Chinatown station. There would be significant environmental and ridership studies that would have to be done and performed as a part of this design work. We probably would require to have to do a supplemental environmental impact statement to go back down this route. And then the station selections would also have to be evaluated, because bypassing it completely may not be the most ideal. And this is just a visual map of what the route would look like. The yellow is the guideway as planned, and then the red would be basically the Nimitz bypass, connecting back at Chinatown Station. And then the pros and cons: costs would potentially be less because of fewer stations, and possibly less utilities, but that's one of our unknowns. And then it continues access to downtown area without the same utility issues along Dillingham. But there would be a potential 7 to 10 year delay due to FTA review and approvals for an environmental impact statement to change the alignment. We would probably have possible ridership impacts, but we would know that after we did a ridership study. And then the new station locations and right-of-way acquisitions along Nimitz. And then it also introduces new unknown utilities and Superfund challenges, because along Nimitz, especially in the Ivole area, there is known contamination that we would have to deal with. There is the IDPP site in the Ivole area that we would have to contend with. And then on top of that, we would then have to re-engage with the Hawaii DOT, because Nimitz is now one of their primary arteries, and much discussion would have to be had with DOT because of the impacts to traffic on the Nimitz Highway, as well as it just being there under their jurisdiction. They would have the final say whether or not HART would be able to enter into Nimitz Highway to begin with. So those are some of the options that we will be looking at, have been looking at a very high level. But option 3, the a la carte evaluation, is basically the process that we will probably go through with decision makers, including our HART board, to come up with the most beneficial scenario of what to do going forward, knowing our budgetary constraints. We will take the feedback that we get today from both the board as well as from the public, and share it with various entities, including the mayor's office, our city council, and have further discussions with you on the board. We understand that a working group will be formed to develop a plan for completing the project in a manner that is in the best interest and benefit of the public. And then on top of that, separately, we will also be advising our current city center, guideway, and station priority listed offerers in our active procurement as to the current status and potential timeline for the remaining procurement. We will likely be issuing an addendum that will indicate to our offerers that we will be putting a hold on the procurement, so that they do not put full board effort into their development of their proposals while we still have some unknowns in terms of what will actually be contracted and procured. So with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions from the board.
As stated earlier, we will now take a testimony from the public, and we thank you for holding until the presentation. I'm sure that after this presentation, it may affect what you may have anticipated saying. And after the normal testimony, Cindy, what is it, 2 minutes per? 2 minutes per individual. We will then go to the board that I know are waiting anxiously to ask you questions, Brennan. So with that, I'm going to call you in the order of what I believe you signed up, because this is how I got them. Russell Homma. Welcome, Mr. Homma.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations on putting your nomination papers for running for the Congress. I'm sure you get elected for getting your old seat back. As well, I'd like to congratulate Ivan Nu Kwan. I heard that he will be leaving the HART board in end of June, so I know he was there from day one when the HART board was established. As well, Mr. Hong as well. So then I know that Michael Formby came on board, but other than that, some of the old timers that remember me. I was testifying from day one, even before the HART board was even established. So I just wanted to go over the concern about the full funding agreement. I know that the FTA requires the minimum operating segment, MOS, under the EIS study that was submitted. So that cost to go into the Middle Street. So in other words, in order to enhance the full funding agreement, the minimum operating segment must be included, which stops at Middle Street. So I know that now with the funding being with limited resources here, with the cost overruns and change orders, that we need to establish some kind of means to get this project going with the funding on the budget. So in other words, we have to keep this, I support this project, but we just got to manage it correctly. And I know these options that on the table for enhancing this project, besides going beyond the Middle Street, you might want to look under the option 3 and 4, which, continue the project until the funds deplete, because you can always ask for additional federal funding, and that gives more time as well. If you can privatize the TOD, the transit-oriented development for the train station development, and try to generate revenues. Maybe I know we had a plan in the past, maybe the DTS or the HART board can manage the whole alignment and using the land use policy, just like airports that state DOT does with the duty-free shoppers. We are managing the, developments and businesses that arise from the airport, and the state gets a piece of the pie or the percentage from the duty-free shoppers operation. And same thing can happen over here with the alignment. If the city gets the jurisdiction of all the development rights, they can sublease it and generate revenues that way. And I think there's a lot of ways that you can do innovative financing on that behalf. In other ways, big concern,
Mr. Humo, I'm going to have to ask you to start wrapping up. Your
Okay,
time
my
is
wrap
up.
up is, worst comes to worst, as you know, the feds, the federal employees, as with the state employee, because of the sequester and fiscal cliff that we had, there was furloughs. So maybe in this case, if we can't go according to the budget, we might have to ask voluntarily to the contractors and subcontractor to have a furlough, like taking off 10 or 20% off the contract. That way, at least they can keep the contract and create jobs for the labor unions, so-called blue-collar union work. At least there's jobs being established on this project, and we can maintain the project and trying to manage it correctly. When the chips are down, when we're having a hard time, I think everybody needs to contribute and be a good corporate citizen and work on this project.
Thank you, Mr. Humo. Barbara Armitrott?
Good morning.
Good afternoon, Barbara.
Oh, it's afternoon. Yeah, that's true. Good afternoon. Barbara Armitrout. For the record, I'm a member of Neighborhood Board 5, but I'm speaking as an individual. And I also want to congratulate you in your running for the seat in Washington. I personally am glad you are head of this board, because finally we're getting through some stuff here. I think the one person that needs to weigh in on this is the people. I know it says it's going to mayor and city council, but I believe the people have stood by here, and you can't just make all these decisions without consulting them. People were going to say everything they said was coming true and to light, but people now get on an express bus. They're not going to want to get on a bus to get to the rail, to get back on another bus, when they can just stay on the bus. So I personally don't want HART to take down OTS and Handy Van, even if Handy Van is late, even if the buses have been cut. And that's why I believe that HART should be under the city, with under the bus and the Handy Van, because HART has shown it's not doing so well, and I sure don't want both of those under HART to destroy both of the only transportations we really do have for the elderly and disabled. I don't know why you don't just skip the airport, because if you go to the airport to pick up tourists, they're going to have to get off on Middle Street to get on a bus to go to Waikiki. Now that doesn't make sense at all. skip the airport and have a station downtown, because a lot of people on the west side of Oahu are coming to go downtown. And they could get straight downtown on the rail without having to get up on another bus. I don't know. I think it's a mess, is what it is. But anyway, I think the people should weigh in on this, and thank you, everybody on the board, because this is not easy. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and just so that you do know, this is exactly the way the board feels as well, that the people must weigh in. And your concern, vote the charter amendment, because the charter amendment puts the operations of HART under DTS. Okay, next person, Rose Poe. There she is. Good afternoon, Rose.
Good afternoon. I'm Rose Poe. I believe that you should keep the handy van and the bus and HART separate. You guys have not looked at what they're doing. They're trying to put the rail in with the handy van and bus. It's not going to work, because they already tried to take our 5307 funds, which were for bus, and try to give it to HART. We don't want that. We need more handy vans. We got enough, almost enough to meet the quota that we have of riders. Now, when the riders get older, like you guys get older, and you have to have handy van, there won't be any. So I want you guys to keep the HART away from the handy van and the bus. Keep it separate. And if it has to stop at Middle Street, that's fine. But you're going to have the same gridlock as is now. When you put the buses on the road with the cars, it's just going to be stop and go. You need to make it into town, at least to South Street, where they can get off of that, and most of the people have already gotten off and transferred on the other buses that go to Alamoana and Waikiki and Kalihi, and Hawaii Kai and stuff like that. So that's the way I figure.
Thank you, Rose. Members, I'm sorry I didn't ask if anybody had any questions of any of the former testifiers or of Rose. I assume no one said anything, so I'm going to move on. I gotta apologize. Is it Gigi or Jig Greenwood? Yes, sorry.
Thank you for holding these hearings today. My name is Gig Greenwood. I've lived in the islands most of my life. The first day I arrived in Hawaii, I went to the beach in Waikiki and was told to leave because the tsunami was coming, and that day Hilo was wiped out. I was on my way to the Philippines at the time, and I was 12 years old. Hawaii's been my home pretty much ever since as a military brat. I'd lived all over the world, and I've been fortunate enough to travel all over the world. As a child, I traveled from Philadelphia to Long Island by trains. My mother grew up for part of her life in the train station. I've ridden trains all over Japan, Europe, and America. I've crossed the country, U.S. by train. In '94, I rode, I believe, the Ansaldo's trains from Washington, D.C. to Maryland to visit with friends. The first train I ever wanted to ride in Japan was the monorail, which today moves 311,000 people a day, which is more than twice that we're talking about, maximum, or 3 times. And it's the fastest way to get from Haneda Airport to downtown Tokyo still, 40 years later. To try and cover everything in 2 minutes, which has been presented in 40 minutes, is going to be difficult. So I'm going to read some of these things that I've had prepared, and then I'll comment on these later other things. And in no particular order. Ansaldo has lied to the people on numerous occasions at the cost of their products. At least twice, Ansaldo submitted fraudulent bids that were only a fraction of the true cost. When days of being awarded the contract, Ansaldo said they could not provide all the required stops, UH, Waikiki, nor the airport, and the price tripled. Never did the city administration or city council members question this obvious deception and malfeasance in the current council. The Ho'opili train doesn't stop here. The train at Ho'opili has 2 stops, not Kapolei or farther west, where local people can make use of it. HART's latest flyer proclaims that 5,000 people per hour by the year 2030, with 80% standing, against 60,000 new homes and commuters in Ho'opili. The Disney World monorail moves 6,000 people an hour. We're building a toy train here, folks. The Bombardier São Paulo, Brazil monorail, which was proposed to be built here in Honolulu and which was rejected by the city administration because they wrote a contract which allowed them to eliminate anyone that they didn't like, will move 48,000 people an hour. That's 10 times what this rail will move. 10 times more. That will move enough people every day to make a difference. Rush hour, 3
I'm
hours.
going to have to ask you to wrap up.
Yeah,
And you
sorry.
can put the rest in writing to us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see. Option 6. We scrap what we're doing and we start over again. We could save $4 billion because the Bombardier bid was $3.8 billion to put in a monorail which covered UH, Waikiki, the airport, and Ala Moana, which is what needs to be done. It only needs half the support system because it doesn't make noises. When I was in Florida at the Disney World Hotel, I had to go twice, came through the hotel, and I missed it trying to take pictures of it. It is so quiet. Yet, what we're proposing now, if anybody's been to New York or in the big cities where they have elevated rail, you know that the noise will drive everybody crazy within a half a mile of the rail, the rail line there. And again, trying to wrap this up quickly with all of the stuff that we need to cover.
Mr. Greenwood, may I recommend that you put whatever you have and send it to us in writing?
I have copies I'll distribute to
Okay.
you and to the.
If you give it to Cindy there, right here,
But
she'll get it to us.
we need to stop this now and save the people's money because this is totally out of control. It's like the Iraq syndrome. We said we won the war, but we lost the peace. Well, Ansaldo got the contract, but we're losing the war here. It's going billions and billions and billions and billions over, and it's not going to stop. The steel and steel train could have been ridden by King Kamehameha I, and we're being condemned to ride this for the next 200 years. And it's going to cost $100 per person for each leg to go into Honolulu, and $100 for each person to come back, and that's what it's going to cost everybody out of their pockets.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. Any question, members? Thank you very much. Natalie Iwasa, you submitted written testimony. I don't have one of these, but I'm checking whether you would like to testify. Come forward, Natalie.
Thank you. Thank you for holding this discussion. Natalie Iwasa for the record. Yes, I did submit detailed testimony. You know, in order to make a good decision, you need to have good numbers, and unfortunately, you haven't had them. And the testimony I sent in writing today shows that. And if these numbers had been correct and clear from the beginning, we probably wouldn't have the cap where we do on bills 18 and 19. It would have been probably about $80 million higher. That's why this is so important, in addition to the fact that we're spending taxpayer money, and taxpayers expect good numbers. I also wanted to remind the board and everyone that we were told that there would be 10,000 local jobs. And as of today, or the most recent report I saw, it's about 10% of that. So what happens if the ridership projections are off and we're only going to get, I don't know, 10%, 50% even? What happens then? The ridership numbers that I was given as the raw data, they had errors. They did not add up. The other thing we need to remember with respect to this is that we are paying for this with a tax on food, rent, and medical services. And while, yes, visitors pay 20% or so of the overall cost, this is a very detrimental tax on our low-income people. And when the surcharge extension went through, I heard one of the senators say, it's okay because we took care of the low-income people. We extended the food excise tax credit. Well, they extended it for 2 years. They did nothing with the rental credit, the $30. And so this is really a bad way to pay for this project. We also have to remember that 40% of our residents are renting. And so you have such a hard decision, but I ask you to take into consideration all of these facts because, you know, we could end up with a whole lot more homeless people and a rail that really isn't being used the way it was envisioned. So if you have any questions at all on these numbers, I know sometimes some of this is hard to understand, but my phone is always there. I'm always willing to meet with any of you to go over this because it's so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Any questions, members? Thank you, Natalie. That ends the list of people who signed up. Anyone else? Go ahead. Either one of you in the back. Please state your name.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Horning. I am the owner of Honolulu Hardwoods that owns property down in Kaka'ako. My testimony today is I was wondering, in light of the budgeted finance shortfall, is this the reasoning why HART is only offering us 50% on a dollar for our property? And what's really aggravating more than anything else is our neighboring property was not only offered, but they paid $640 a square foot. Now that's the neighboring property of ours. We are only offered $220. And I'm wondering if this is how they're going to try and catch up with their budget. I just feel that it's really unfair. I mean, I have prime property in Kaka'ako. Developers would love to have it, and they would pay well over $400 for my property. Also explain why HART is willing to go to court and spend money in filing a lawsuit against Honolulu Hardwoods in this manner, fully knowing that the average market value by recorded sales comparison in Kaka'ako is $428.89 per square foot. And I look forward to anybody's response.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you very much. The gentleman in the last row.
Good afternoon. Thanks for squeezing me in. Thanks. My name is Eric Ryan, and it was very difficult
Sorry,
coming
I
here.
didn't get your name.
Eric Ryan, R-Y-A-N. Very difficult being here today. First time I've testified on anything rail related. I led the petition drives in '92 against rail, in 2008 against rail. And it's sad to see everything come true. That was very easily predicted. It was sad sitting through a presentation just now called "Let's Keep Building Until We Run Out of Money." As a taxpayer, that's just disgusting. Personally, I think we should stop at Middle Street. And I don't just mean stop at Middle Street, I mean totally stop at Middle Street, wind this thing down. Operations costs, I don't believe a single politician or bureaucrat on these operations and maintenance costs for each year. I sat there while Wayne Yoshioka testified, and it took him 10 minutes to answer a straight question back in 2008 about how it was going to get paid for. It took him 10 minutes for someone to squeeze out of him the answer, property taxes will probably have to go up. And I know that we're still facing a lack of truth here. Stop at Middle Street, get Waikiki out of your mind, get UH out of your mind, get Kapolei downtown and Disney out of your mind. We can't afford this thing. Express buses are great. I ride them every day to and from work with my bike, and it's not a problem. It works great. Please stop thinking ahead, because I know we're burying the lead here. We might be talking about how to get through this election year with some fake caps and fake ceilings. We might think we're going to fool people into thinking we can keep these prices down, and then a new set of politicians come along and say, oh, well, you know what, they handed us a raw deal, we'll have to raise it. But what really is going on in this building and in this room is people are thinking, I wonder if I'm still going to be working at HART. when we start building to Waikiki, when we start building to UH, when we start building to Kapolei and all the great development deals and construction deals and all that. So I just want to conclude by saying there's a lot of us who want to get out there and start signing petitions again and put a cap on this thing that keeps anyone in this room from disagreeing and disregarding voters ever again. I understand you guys got to make a living, but you're going about it the wrong way. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you very much. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, I'm Catherine Graham with Faith Action for Community Equity, and we have supported rail all along with the idea that it offers opportunities for affordable housing being built along the rail line. This presentation was really discouraging, and I'm wondering if there's a way to jump into the total commercialization of selling sponsorships for each station. I just saw that, you know, the stadiums on the mainland that are named after corporations, they get $20 million a year for 20 years just to put their name on an athletic stadium. I don't think we can get $20 million for 20 years for a rail station, but maybe we can do something like that and raise the extra money. One of the things traveling around the world in metro stations is how cool some of those stations are with art exhibits and you know, all kinds of neat things. And if we do cool things in our stations and charge a lot of money for somebody to do those cool things at each station, I think we can do it and really make this a world-class rail project. So thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, members? Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi, my name is David Sarish.
David, I'm sorry, your full name?
David Sarish, S-A-R-I-S-H. If I'm not mistaken, this was shot down by the popular vote when it was put to general election and pushed through by special interest groups. There's several questions: cost, how long will it take, where will it go, how many jobs will it create, and ridership. And I think all of them have been, the answers to all of them have been compromised. I feel it should be stopped now. I think it'll cost $500 million to stop and take it down. I don't think Hawaii's ready for rail. It should have been started at the core and gone out concentrically instead of starting at the ending. I think it, the rail carriages are here, yet the rail's not going to be ready till 2024. Are they going to be homeless shelters until then? I just don't get it, seriously. I just don't see at this time the value of it, and I think it should be stopped.
Thank you, David. Any questions? Thank you very much. There was another hand that went up here. Yes.
My name is Gladys Kaeo, K-A-E-O. I think we have the best system in the world, and I think we need to stop the rail. I've lived here for 50 years, and I know that this rail is good. I was on the mainland for a few months when they found out I had cancer, and the first thing my doctor said to me, who was born and raised in Hawaii, is get home to Hawaii, where you have the buses and a good transportation system, because it was taking me 2 hours each way by rail and bus in Sacramento to get to the clinic and hospital. And I took my doctor's advice, came home, and we do have the best bus system, and I think we need to stop the rail. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of Gladys, members? Thank you very much. Yes.
My name is Shem Lawler. I'm the Clean Transportation Director for Blue Planet Foundation. I would just like to state that We have a good bus system. I wouldn't say it's great. It's certainly not the best bus system. Our bus system has been capped at ridership capacity about 250,000 boardings per day since 1981. Basically, as a rides per capita basis, we've been dropping ever since that time. We simply can't expand the bus system anymore because of the limited number of east-west lines we have in the major corridor. We just have the geographical alignment of our city makes it very difficult to expand the bus system. That same geographical configuration makes rail an obvious choice and very effective. We have a very linear design. We've needed this rail system since the 70s. We're going to continue needing it until it gets here. So yes, rail is very expensive. Yes, it's very difficult to build. These kind of large civic projects are very difficult to complete. There's a lot of challenges, but these challenges are not going to get easier if we kick them 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road. So we need to explore every option to make sure we can minimize the costs now and maximize the utility of the system now. But ultimately, we need to find a solution that limits how far we kick the can down the road and explore options to get it finished, get it completed. And let me state more, it's not enough to build the rail system. We need to be maximizing the ridership. We need to be implementing policies that limit the expansion of suburban sprawl and auto-oriented development. This project will help us do that, but it's a facilitator, it's a tool. And there's a wide array of other policies that are going to help us to maximize the use of that tool. Ultimately, the rail system is going to be judged by how well it's utilized and what the benefits are, not the costs. And that's all I have to say.
Any questions of Mr. Lawler?
Yes,
Thank you.
I have a
Yes.
question. So I didn't realize your organization had a clean transportation function, so.
Yes, we've been working on transportation for a couple of years now.
So do you have some kind of professional qualification in that area?
Sure, I'm a urban planner. I got my master's degree at UH, and I worked on TOD for the city's planning department for 6.5 years before joining Blue Planet.
So does Blue Planet have any opinion as to what the impact of some of the alternatives that are being considered right now might have as far as public acceptance of
We would have to look at them on an individual basis, but ultimately we support public transportation and electrification of public transportation, and all the kind of mechanisms. What we really want is a rich transportation ecosystem that allows people to live without cars or to minimize the number of cars that they have. Basically, we have a monoculture now. We have cars. Even buses operate within the same rights-of-way. So it's really, and ultimately, if you're going to see a lot of switches to a lot of mode shift, you have to create neighborhoods and communities where people can live without a car. If they can take transit to and from work, but they have to have a car to do their grocery shopping or run errands, they're still going to own a car, and the economic rationale is going to dictate that they still drive everywhere they go. So that's why the TOD component is just as important, and having other alternatives like car share and bike share, and those things are really going to make it's going to complete the picture. But we can't do any of those things if we don't have a place to put people when they get out of their cars. And right now, we don't have a bus system that can accommodate more than 6% of mode share.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else to testify? If not, then members, any of you have any questions? Colbert, I know you have to leave. Do you need to?
No, actually, I can't make out of it.
Oh, okay. So, Board Member Formby.
Thank you, Chair. So, Brennan, I guess I'll go by page to ask some questions. First on the page that had the projected cost estimate at 7.967, back near the beginning, that page, yeah. So I know when the FTA PMOC letter came in, it gave a range based on a different type of modeling system than what we use, or an estimating system. And their range was 7.7 to roughly 8.0, based on a P50 to a P65. And today you've told us that the 7.967 that you're showing was built using a different system. It was built using a bottoms-up system.
Correct.
And for me, I guess it's very difficult because then it's like apples and oranges. If you can't put a P on this and tell me what the percent likelihood of us achieving total system build out at 7.967 billion, then I don't know how to compare it to where the FTA is at. So I know you said we're working on the P model, but I think it sort of begs the question, why do we estimate in a way that is different than the FTA? And at the end of the day, how do we bring the two together so that as a board and on the public's behalf, we can have some sense as to what the likelihood is of building this project at that number?
I think the general difference is, and I'm not one who delves too much into probabilities. The more traditional method of doing estimates is a bottoms-up estimate where you actually look at quantities, current unit pricing, and then from there you start attaching certain factors that address inefficiencies from traffic control limitations, working at night versus working during the day, hours of the day. So you work from a baseline upwards, and then you start adjusting that baseline for different reasons. The FTA's model is more of a probabilistic model where it's a top-down method, and they use factors based on experience or from other projects across the country, and then they try and model it downwards towards what they consider to be more Hawaii-centric factors. So we are attempting to try and do an apples-to-apples comparison by doing a probabilistic model. We do have consultants who are very familiar with the way that the FTA does their top-down estimating. So we are looking at trying to get a comparison. I don't think that the number is going to be that far off once we get to doing the apples-to-apples comparison in terms of what they're looking at in terms of their range from a P50 to a P65.
Okay, so accepting that the way in which we come up with our number is different than the FTA, and we are going to work on a number that is the same way they calculate it, can you at least give us a probability for the current figure that you've put up here? Because I would want to know what the likelihood of us achieving this number is based upon you've now broken it down by station all the way back to Middle Street. I need to know, is that a 50% chance or a 65% chance, irrespective of how you built your model? What's your percentage?
I would, and I'm uncomfortable giving a percentage because that's not how it's done. But I mean, if I had to give somewhere, where does it fall? It's somewhere between the P50 and P65. I would probably err on the side that it's closer to the P65.
Okay. Well, I'd like you maybe to think about if there's a way for you to come up with a probability or a percentage if we use the bottoms-up model. Sure. Because I think we need to know what the probability is of achieving at any of these numbers that are in the brief. And I'm willing to use the bottoms-up model if I know what the percentage of likelihood is. So I think we need to have that.
Sure.
And
Could I add something just to say, also there's I think an important and critical piece of information for all of us that we'll get next week, because the next section of Guideway and Stations, the so-called airport section, the best and final offer round is closing next week, and those numbers are due in, I believe, next Friday. So shortly after an evaluation, we'll be in a position to actually give you a significant portion of the remainder of the project an actual price.
yeah, and I understand that, and I think that's great. And I think it'll help us and the PMOC. But I still think if we're going to use a different system of estimating than the FTA does, I would like to at least have a percentage or probability associated with our system as well.
Yes, we'll work on that.
Okay. The second thing is, we get asked all the time, I know Chair Hanabusa does as well as probably the other board members, how did we get into a situation, and this is to the prior chart really, go back one, go back two, right? No, backwards. Yeah, right there. And you look at the time frames, and the very short time frames in which our numbers have been off. And so it says by late 2014, there was concern, and I know we had a letter from the chair at that time that added money to the budget. Then we went into the legislative session, and we came out in July, and we had a number. And between July and January, which was Bill 23, we had a number, and every step along the way, we've missed the numbers. And so people ask us all the time, how does that happen? And I think the board should hear it before the public hears it. Tell us, how does that happen? How is it that we're always chasing numbers?
I have not seen escalation increases this fast before, but I would just say that whenever we get into our construction cycles, and you're on the part of the cycle that is on the rise, you will always be chasing an estimate, because the estimate is based on a point in time, and it's not uncommon for you to constantly be low during the upward trend of a construction cycle. Just like on the conversely, you will constantly be high on the downward cycle, and so that is, I would say, in large part what's going on. But I have not seen, through my own personal experience, this kind of gap in chasing the numbers.
Yeah, so I think the question that I get from the public in response to the escalation in the construction industry is that if you know that's the case, then for the future, you are also escalating. So if you're saying, well, today we're at 6.8, then you say, but next year we'll actually be at 7.5. In other words, escalation doesn't stop at the point at which you come up with your number. It keeps moving forward. And it seems like that's what we don't do. We don't look forward and say, since we're going to be constructing through 2022 to 2024, the number's going to keep going up.
We actually do. And so when you try and capture a point in time of when you actually might contract a price, you are trying to put together an estimate that if the construction contract is over a multi-year period, so let's just say 4 years, you try and capture what is going to be the median escalation over that 4-year period. So you try and capture either in year 2 or 3 what is going to be your cost, and you try and base your escalated values also on the quantity and timing of the work. So if you have a lot of upfront work, then you're going to escalate that early work differently than you would escalate the back end of the work. And so you try your best to estimate when certain types of work is going to be done, and then you use an average escalation over a 4-year period, 3-year period, whatever your construction estimation is going to be. And then once you capture that cost, once you contract it, theoretically that's what's supposed to be your cost. Right? It's not going to continue to escalate over the life of the contract, because you've already contracted and locked those prices in at that point in time. So the art of estimating becomes very difficult when you're going through a very volatile cycle, which we are right now, more volatile than I've seen. But just trying to figure out when you're actually going to procure, because for every month that we don't procure a contract for either airport guideway and stations or city center, we're pushing out that escalation as well. And so for every month, our cost estimates become that much more stale and inaccurate. So it's really a combination of many things, but yeah, I mean, the pricing has changed so much more that I've never seen the chasing of a price like this before.
Okay. Chair, I have other questions, but I don't want to move on if other board members have questions in the same area.
I just had questions generally, not necessarily in this area, but let me say for the record that I had the same question that Director Formby had, because 1 year ago when we went to the state legislature, the number we were asking for was $910 million, and just 5 months later, it was a higher number, and then now it's a higher number. And I would have expected, that the process would be as you've indicated, that you're not just looking at it now, but you're looking into the future. And so I guess the concern, I think that's the real word, the concern is that, and it's not just us, it's not just the board, it's not just the staff, but it's also, you know, the FDA's been looking at it, the PMOC's been looking at it, so we've all kind of got it, haven't got it right. And so what that does, to me anyway, and I'm sure it's already had this impact on others, is you lose confidence in the numbering and in the projections, and so that's the concern. And so I think if there's any suggestion, the suggestion would be that we really dig deep, figure out what's right here, and maybe be an accountant, be an accountant and err on the conservative side. So that was that. I just want to say for the record, that was a concern that I also had in that area. I want to make a confession, and that is, I've been on this board for about 5 years, and even before I got sworn in, one of the questions I had of Wayne Yoshioka, who at that time was the Director of Transportation Services, and the Director of the Department of Transportation Services has really been involved in moving this project along. And so one of the things I asked Wayne, I said, why, when you get into particularly when you get into the Civic Center, why don't you do it at grade so that you minimize the visual impacts? I said, when I go to San Francisco, I love San Francisco, but I can't imagine having an elevated system right down Market Street or Powell Street. It will just destroy the ambiance of that city. And they seem to survive okay, with a trolley car and so forth, other forms of public mass transportation. And so I'm not so sad about option number 2A. Just given my, I'm not an engineer. I'm not a technical person. It's just kind of a simple citizen and thinking, well, how does this look, to our city? And so I kind of like 2A. So with 2A, obviously, what Wayne said, you can't do it. Yoshika said you can't do it because of the, we got a full, at that time we didn't have a full funding grant agreement. We had an EIS, so you got to change your EIS. It's just going to be too difficult to modify that. And so here we are potentially looking at 2A, which is to build to Middle Street as planned and continue with an at-grade rail system, to the Ala Moana Center. So the questions I have are several. One is, what is the cost of this supplemental EIS that would be involved, and what kind of delays would be involved in performing the supplemental EIS?
So first, the easy question is the duration. An EIS typically takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years, and then you'd probably add on another 3 years for design. So you're probably looking at least a 7 to 10 year period in which you would have to basically go through the planning and design phase before you could get into construction.
What about the cost?
Cost, we don't have a number. We would have to evaluate something for that. But I would point out though that if one of the issues of going at grade would pose different issues that we would have to address, right? Putting something at grade would actually require more trenching, because you still, for that corridor, that to place the at-grade rail tracks and stuff, you're still excavating at least 4 to 5 feet down below that area. And so if EV or other kinds of utilities is an issue for the guideway, where we have limited footprints for our shafts, that would actually exacerbate that problem, because now you are actually in the zone, underground zone, where the majority of your utilities lie, as well as the potential for encountering EV significantly increases. Not to mention, if you do go with light rail, you have the catenary above, which does not necessarily take away the 138 kilovolt issue along Dillingham, because now you may have potentially conflicting electrical lines in the area, as well as making it difficult. Still, I mean, it would remain difficult for HECO to access those lines. So we would still have to deal with the 138s along Dillingham if we were to go to that kind of system. And then on top of that, we would need to really relook at how we deal with the ridership, because if we expect the same kinds of ridership levels that we're going to be carrying on a 4-car train, once you go at grade, you cannot have 4-car trains going through downtown, specifically because they may be longer than a single block, and you will be blocking intersections. And so we would have to relook at smaller train configurations, which would then impact how many people we could actually carry. And then on top of that, going to a new type of car and a new system, we would have to look at finding a location in urban Honolulu to place a maintenance facility. And that would approximately be about 30 to 40 acres in size.
Ask some questions? Dan, a lot of the discussion, public discussion that we've had, about the increased escalating costs, with this project, the response has been, well, we will know, when the bids come in for the airport section, and that'll give us a good idea what the Civic Center bid will be. And so what I understand is that we would get a sense in sometime mid-June. We're like a week away. But if you do a best and final offer analysis, it'll be sometime in August. And so we're talking about all these options, and these options assume these numbers that Brennan posted, in his presentation, close to $8 billion. And these numbers are based on the projections made by the FTA and by our staff now. But again, those are projections, and the actuals are going to be in hand hopefully in the next couple of weeks or so, or maybe at latest mid-August. Where are we with that?
So we're actually ahead of that schedule. We already went through the first round and determined that we could make some change. We went through the first round, reviewed the bids, prices, and the solicitations that came in, the offers, and we sat with the offerors and had very good discussions. And as the conclusion of that, we did determine that a best and final offer, or a BAFO round, would be in order. So we've actually we're already in that BAFO round. We're a little bit ahead of our schedule. So we expect to get responses back again next week, Friday, I think the 17th. And we'll have an evaluation and review period. So we think rather than in August, we'll probably have that answer for you in July.
Okay. So we're not going to hear anything by the next board meeting, which is the middle of June, is what you're saying, because you're in the BAFO.
Well, actually, our next board meeting is actually next Thursday, so the BAFO round comes in on Friday.
Okay.
Madam Chair, may I just respond to one quick thing?
I'm sorry,
to
Mr.
Foreman?
Greenwood. This is, the public comment period has basically passed. So if you wish to speak to Mr. Formby after we are through, you have that
No,
option.
it's for the good of the whole board, if I may.
But no, we have to get through this section right now.
Well, ma'am, if I
Or
may.
we'd have to allow every single testifier to come back to address the board. So that's not what we want to do at this time. So if you don't mind, if you could wait till after we're done, and then we can call you back up at that time.
Could I just make just one quick comment then, please?
No, no, because if I let you do it, Mr. Greenwood, I'll have to let everybody else do it. So please abide by our process. Members, yes, Mr. Lee.
There's a saying, sometimes you're better off the devil you know than the devil you don't. And I kind of feel like that's where we're at. We have a lot of information about the problems with the project as currently planned. When we look at these options, I mean, just endless questions go through my mind. How long is it going to take us to determine the impact on ridership, which is the most critical element of it? What kind of delay is that going to create? What kind of cost increases are we going to see? What new types of uncertainties are going to be injected into the process? And so a lot of times, when you're dealing with a difficult project, you have to just bite the bullet and move forward the best you can. I think we owe it to the public to evaluate the options, but I think we also owe it to the public to be decisive and to make the hard decisions that need to be made based on the best available information we have. So in that context, what I would like to understand is, before selecting this particular type of technology and the route and the elevated approach, what other options were evaluated before settling on this plan?
Okay, now you're asking questions long before I was here.
Jesse?
Jesse, do you know?
Jesse?
I mean, I know from what I understand of the process that went on before, was that the FTA's NEPA process allows you to do or conduct an alternatives analysis prior to embarking on a final EIS document. And the EIS would simply study the selected, what is the term? The preferred alternative. Yeah. And so that's kind of how the process went. Was the city went through an alternatives analysis, looked at various technologies, steel on steel, rubber tire, as well as maglev and monorail. Came up with a decision on, and I also understood that they had a panel of experts that were selected to review or be a part of this screening committee. They came up with a decision on steel as the best alternative, and that is what was ultimately studied as a part of the environmental impact statement.
And further than that, actually, in 2010, the question of steel on steel rail was actually an issue placed before the voters. So there's actually a vote on that in, I think it was 2010, which the voters voted to support that alternative that had ultimately recommended through the process that Brennan described. But I was just wondering, maybe in broader context, Jesse, if you could describe, the alternatives analysis that takes place for both route and technology?
Sure. So I was with the project when the final EIS was prepared. That was after the alternatives analysis was completed, but that's a part of the NEPA process, and Brennan sort of gave a good explanation of it. But the alternative analysis at the time looked at different technologies, different routes. It was based on what's in the Oahu Metropolitan Planning Organization's ORTP, or Oahu Regional Transportation Plan, which showed the corridor that they'd be studying. So the problem that the alternatives was looking at was, how do we increase rider mobility, access to groups that need access to transit who can't afford to drive. How do we reduce congestion in this high-capacity corridor? And so different alternatives were looked at as part of the alternatives analysis. I believe it was 2005. So it looked at steel and steel. It looked at grade. It looked at going down Kamehameha. It looked at different options around the airport. It looked at different stations. And that all happened in the context of public outreach, public discussions. The Blue Ribbon panel that was set up sort of around that time by the mayor looked at just specifically the steel on steel issue, and some other issues, looked at maglev and all kinds of different options. And this was the preferred alternative that was carried through the EIS NEPA process, the HEPA process. And it did look at other alternatives in the FEIS, the no-build alternative, and others. It also looked at BRT. So many different types of options were explored. A lot of what we're discussing, in fact, was evaluated and discussed at that time. And that's what they settled on, the preferred alternative. So if we were to do something different, we'd have to go through some of that process, again, depending on what the board decides and the council decides.
Well, specifically like the possibility of stopping the project at Middle Street and then going to that option 2B, which is on-grade rail. I mean, as part of the alternatives analysis done in '05, I mean, wasn't that looked at?
So the alternatives was looked at grade, and there were different, and Brennan actually explained pretty much to summarize why that wasn't an option. One of the major concerns was the impact to burials, because you'd be digging along the whole corridor instead of placed columns. That was one of the concerns. But when you look at the alternatives analysis, the way the NEPA process works is it's phased. So the intensity of review increases as you move toward the end of the process and finally settle on a final action. So although different alternatives were looked at, they weren't looked at a very specific level of where you could get an approval and build it. So if we were to look at an at grade, we'd still need to do additional studies and more specific studies about what the environmental impacts, social, economic, environmental, and what mitigation we'd have to implement to do that. It's an issue of cost and time. That anything's possible.
Which is why we would probably do a supplemental EIS rather than a full independent EIS, because we would be supplementing much of the same information that was done before.
And you would indicate that's like a 7 to 10 year time frame.
For an EIS, it's typically 3 to 5 years. So you could look at somewhere closer to the 3, because we would be able to reuse much of the information before, go through a revalidation process. But because this is a new technology, it would be a little bit more involved. So, I mean, it really depends on how the public involvement process and the reviews for the different alternatives for alternate routes might end up going. So but an average federal EIS or federal NEPA document is about 3 to 5 years.
How long would it take to just do the ridership impact analysis on these different scenarios?
For each individual one, it can be just maybe a few days to a week. But it depends on the number of different scenarios that you'd like us to look at, which is why our recommendation as a part of that process would be to have the discussion on all of the different scenarios and maybe narrow down the scope of what we would want to look at, the number of different alternatives to be considered, and then we can focus the ridership evaluations. And again, these ridership evaluations would be fairly high level. It wouldn't be to the detail probably that FTA would require us at the end of the day. So whatever decision we would come up with, we would refine those ridership evaluations to a much more discrete level that would be acceptable for FTA to sign off on, in terms of agreeing that evaluation is acceptable in terms of truly characterizing the ridership nature and characteristics of the different stations that we would be employing.
And if I could just add, and I've had a similar experience with a request to look at change in mode on a route in a prior job. And I will just tell you that because of the fact that it was studied and was rejected as not the preferred, I'll go back to the original response I had to Board Member Louis Kwan, which is, while the FTA is now open to modifications and changes where they weren't before, and again, I cannot speak for FTA, my guess would be this would be a heavier lift than to do what you've sort of suggested, which is kind of stick with what you know, the mode, the route, that sort of thing would probably be where they'd be more comfortable, because it's been studied and confirmed as the sort of optimal way to go. So I'm not saying that they would say no, but I would think it would be a tougher negotiation with them if that was our suggested change.
So Chair, if I can follow up on the ridership. So I hear you guys say that and I believe it. I mean, I think it is easier to do a clean cut based on what we've already planned and designed. But when you look at the numbers that we've received, it basically shows that if you were at 100% probability, we could get to Kapalama. 100% probability. And we're not there. I don't think we're at 100%. So Kapalama is not a good intermodal transfer point for bus and handy van. I mean, it's got a canal on one side, a community college on the other, and private property, Stanford Car and stuff. Kalihi's not a good intermodal transfer point, so that puts you back to Middle Street. And then you have excess funds left over, and the scary thing about Middle Street is when you look at your ridership, and I know these are boardings, but this system is generally intended to bring people from Eva into town and then back Eva. I mean, that's the design of the building. So when it says boardings, they're really talking probably AM, PM, peak hour, but for anything east of Aloha Stadium, it's probably people going home. If you add up the boardings from Kalihi to Ala Moana, it's 51,115. So if we stop at Middle Street, it's not one for one that those people are going to get on bus and we're going to do BRT. You're going to lose riders. And it affects the functionality of the system. So that's why it becomes exactly what Board Member Lee was saying. It becomes very complicated.
Yes.
It becomes extremely complicated for us to figure out how you make this a functional system when you're faced at shortening the route somewhere less than downtown. To me, downtown is the minimum. You got to get downtown, but I don't see how we do it looking at these numbers.
Board Member Hong.
Yeah, Professor Morio, in the 40s, I rode the ORNL train down Nimitz. It worked beautiful. The corridor was great. It got us to Ala Park to the Ipali station. They said it wasn't an option because HDOT had the viaduct extension plan. Is that true? Is that the reason it didn't go down the Nimitz corridor?
I believe that was the primary reason, because DOT had indicated that it did not want the rail project to inhibit any of its current plans at that point in time.
And by the way, Member Hong, you know that it was him, right? It was Brennan who was, just so that we're clear.
Yes. He's on both sides.
It was HDOT.
Thank you for pointing that out, Chair Hong.
I want to know what authority you're speaking with.
You talk a lot about the archaeological and the EIS studies, but if you were to utilize the same corridor that the ORNL trains ran on, would you still have to do the same EIS, the same archaeological studies? Okay, if you do, you say it takes roughly about 5 years to do an abbreviated study. Is that correct?
3 to 5 years, yes.
Okay. What's the possibility of starting construction, say, on Ward or Ala Moana and build back to Ava Street where the crossing of the Dillingham train would end up? And then at the same time, waiting for that EIS study and the FTA.
I believe that we would probably have issues with what is called segmentation of the environmental planning process, because if you started to build something that does not have what's called independent utility, you cannot typically proceed, especially if you're using federal funds, of which this project has already colored its money with federalization of the project. And so we probably would not be permitted to proceed with building a portion in an area that could not survive or operate if the Nimitz portion does not get approved. And so that option would probably be precluded from our ability to do.
Would that be, say, come under those FTA redesign guidelines?
Yeah, it would fall under the NEPA provisions as well as probably HRS 343 or HEPA, the Hawaii's environmental laws.
no way to get an extension for something like that.
I do
The
not believe
only
not
reason I'm
today.
saying that is that you could continue construction during the time you're doing your EIS study. And there's a possibility of also putting part of the rail on grade on the old corridor and then taking it up elevated when you get to maybe Olive Street where you're looking at tsunami and traffic and other impacts.
I mean, that would give us flexibility in if we were able to do that, but my understanding, and we could always ask Corp Counsel for some kind of opinion on what they would think, but I would imagine, based on the NEPA and 343 documents that I've been involved with in the past, and public works projects, independent utility is extremely important for allowing a public works project to continue forward. So I think we would have probably some legal issues.
Thank you.
Hobart, do you have any questions?
I actually do. So, going back to the project cost estimate that you gave us, the 7.96 billion, how much of that is contingency?
So our number includes about 15% contingency applied to the non-contracted work, and then also 15% applied to various parts of work still to be performed on the west. So my understanding is that that is approximately almost $800 million in added or new contingency as a part of this estimate.
800 million?
800 of new contingency, right? Yeah, 800 million of new contingency.
So what is the total?
Yeah. Out of the full 7.9?
Corey Ellis, Project Controls. Yeah, so based off of the remaining contract value, so this is stuff that we haven't spent yet, but is committed under contract, and the new contracts, which would be AGS, CGS, Pearl Highland Transit Garage, the 15% is around $740 million.
Yeah,
That's the total.
740, sorry.
Yeah, total contingency.
And that would be in comparison to, excuse me, to the $8 billion figure that the FTA has, and that $8 billion figure includes 1.1 billion
1.1, yeah,
of contingency.
of contingency.
So I'm confused. So if the FTA's figure at 8 billion includes a 1.14 billion dollar contingency, and your 7.9 billion dollar figure only includes a 740 million dollar contingency, there seems to be your construction cost number is
higher.
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 Yes.
That's
So that kind of goes to
But I thought that so the FTA, aren't they going to require you to have a certain percentage built in as a contingency?
that's what our discussions with them are going on right now. We've provided them with some of this updated information, and that's where our discussions go to whether or not we use a higher contingency number, right? So if you look at the different methodologies of the estimating, so they came in with a slightly lower cost estimate for the project, but they tacked on a higher contingency amount, looking at by saying we believe that there are greater risks or uncertainties that we don't know as we included it into some of the pricing, versus our estimating from a bottoms-up method can look at some of those risks and apply it to unit costs as well, and we would come up with a higher cost estimate, which we would probably say that we could have a higher confidence level in that estimate, so you would throw on a lower contingency percentage. So you might use different methodologies but still come out with a very similar number, just because of the way that you deal with risk.
So that means that the challenge that we'll have going forward is that we got to convince FTA that our process and our methodology for coming up with our number is something that they should be able to have confidence in too, then.
Yes, that's a part of this process right now that we're going through with the FTA.
Okay, so going back to, the question that was asked earlier, so what is your confidence level in terms of being able to convince FTA that our number is acceptable to them?
I mean, I would characterize it as fairly positive. We had not quite a day-long exercise yesterday where we discussed cost containment issues and cost estimates and schedule estimates. And in our meeting with the PMO and the FTA this morning, one of the questions posed to the PMO was what their thoughts of yesterday's workshop was, and they had chimed in and said that they thought that there was a lot of progress, and they were very positive on the level of discussion and some of the detail that HART had been getting into with some of our own numbers that we're providing to them. So I'm fairly optimistic in our discussions with them right now, but the burden is on us to make our case rather than having the PMO or the FTA convince us that they're right. It doesn't work that way. We're responsible for making the case to them in this matter.
As the project progresses and we get past increasing number of costs associated with the construction of the project, does that reduce the level of contingency that is required to be built into the remaining portion of the budget?
Theoretically, yes. But if you just look at the comparison of what we're going through right now, our initial $5.12 billion FFGA budget included $644 million in contingency, and that was before any construction ever started. Now we're talking about $736 million of contingency with just basically 50% of the project left to construct. So that just kind of talks to the level of risk and uncertainty that has been introduced to the project because of a number of or a variety of issues. Number one being the market, construction market.
So what is contingency supposed to actually account for?
Unknowns, differing site conditions, whether it's utilities that might be encountered that weren't expected or are in the wrong places. Maybe your foundations have to go far deeper than what was previously designed for. Changes to work schedule because you don't get a noise variance to do work at night because some of the work that you're doing is actually creating health concerns because it's too loud in residential areas. Or as well as things that might be added. Some of the contingency in the original FFGA was meant to use for positive additions, like the fare gate system that was added after the FFGA, or the platform screen gates for safety on our platforms to prevent people from falling off the platforms. So it's that kind of unanticipated changes that might come through especially in a design build contract or in projects that aren't fully designed, where some of the design aspects might change as the further along you go in design, where you may have either missed something or you want to add something purposefully as a betterment to the project.
Do all of those factors, constitute the increase in construction costs that you allude to as to, the reason why we're dealing with a number closer to $8 billion now?
To some degree, yeah.
Okay, what else would there be, though, to account for that change? That contingency wouldn't be anticipated to cover?
Refinement of design. The more you get into, the original FFGA was based on a budget that was done in a very preliminary engineering state, right? So you don't have a refined design. So you don't exactly know how deep your foundations are, and that kind of stuff. So as you go into a more final design effort, like we have on City Center, you really start to drill down on exactly how deep these foundations might be. And the foundations along the city center portion, mostly along Dillingham, are fairly deep because of the nature of the geologic conditions below ground. And so when you're talking about 8-foot diameter shafts or holes that then have to be filled with concrete and steel, it's a fairly sizable change if you start adding 10% in depth or whatever it is. And when we start looking at the overall cost, the cost is really in the guideway. And more specifically, the cost is in the foundations, is what we're finding more and more.
Brendan, do you want to just give an example of the, I mean, if you went out to the very first columns that went in where Hope Peely Station will be, I think my recollection is that you'd see something like 23 or 25 feet above ground and about 40 feet underground in terms of foundations. The foundations in the city center area are looking at how deep?
Anywhere from 70, 80 feet all the way down to 200 feet or so or more. 200. Oh, over 250 feet in some cases.
So the geological differences of constructing in the second half than the first half with this most expensive part, I think it helps for people to hear that. At least I know when I try to explain to people, because they say, well, how could the guideway cost so much more even than it did in West Oahu, and that's part of the reason.
So these are factors that we could not have reasonably been expected to anticipate 6 years ago.
It's very, I would say it's very difficult to do in the planning phase, which is what the FFGA was based on, the estimates done during planning, which is why at that level you tend to throw on a much higher level of contingency, typically often 35% at that level. But as we refine it now, theoretically your contingency should go up because you know more and your numbers should start to shift. But I would say the majority of the issue is the construction market, but that's not the only issue.
So when you say the majority of it, though, that's what I'm trying to get a sense of. Yeah, how much can we attribute this to factors that are genuinely beyond our control? Yeah. Economic conditions in the construction market are beyond our control. Yeah, we're the victim of that. Yeah, as every other
Correct.
Developer in town. But design, construction, these are all things that are within our control. And so I'm trying to, in my head, separate out where accountability lies as to where these cost overruns stem from.
I would try to maybe answer the question this way, and I don't have the chart with me. You may have seen it before. Ryder Levitt Bucknell has tracked at the firm that tracks construction costs over time. And at the time that let's go back to the time we bid the first contracts in 2009 and 10, because it was post-2008 period, there was actually a negative a decrease in cost of construction on the island for, I think, 2 years. And it was during that period of time that those bids came in several $100 million under the engineer's estimate. Going back to Brennan's description that it's hard to catch the down cycle too, because in this case they were actually too high.
So we were beneficiaries of that.
Beneficiaries. And then at the time that we should have been bidding the remainder of this project, we were on hold because of the Supreme Court case. We had injunctions against acquisitions of property and certain literally ground disturbing activities in the city center area. So some of the type of work that we're doing now to determine the depths of these foundations, we couldn't do that, property acquisitions and so on. And at that time, this is with the signing of the FFGA, the construction increases were in the 3 to 5% per year. In the last 3 years, it has been double digit. In fact, I think last year was 13% increase in construction costs over the prior year, and it was 11% before that. It's projected to be 10% this year and 10% next year. So when we looked at the bids that we opened in 2014 for the 9 stations, and we said, my gosh, the numbers seem to be coming in at something like 60% over what we had estimated in 2012. These guys, Brennan led the team to discover what we could do to try to bring that down. And we thought maybe we could bring it down to like 35 to 45%. I think we got it down to about 40% over those 2012 costs. And most of that was attributable to that compounding of construction cost increases. And I think while you're seeing this now, you could probably do the math if we wanted to sit down and try to answer your question and say, if I just looked at those escalation increases in costs compounded over the last 4 years, at least you'd say it's 40% increases, and if compounded, probably over 50% increases. And that's pretty close to a lot of what we've been seeing, and at least it's a substantial portion, again, of what we've seen for increases. And those same companies that are bidding rely on companies like Ryder, Levitt, Bucknell to give them those cost estimates for the remaining years, which goes to Director Formby's point, which is they're trying to look ahead and say, well, what's that hammer and that rebar going to cost us next year and the year after and the year after during that 4-year period of construction. I think that's how someone could probably do the math and say what has been the direct impact of just construction escalation, and it would be substantial. It's the majority anyway. I don't know how much, it's more than 50% of it, but I don't know if it's 70% of it or something like that.
I mean, I think part of the problem is also when you start to base budgets on planning estimates rather than on estimates that you develop through a more final design. Because once you've gone through the design process, you know a lot of the uncertainties. You have a better idea of what exactly the quantities are. You've done your geotechnical borings. You've done the quantities for how to size your foundations, the strength of your columns and the guideway itself. In a planning phase, in a planning estimate, you're really using very high-level generalized unit pricing that is not necessarily reflective of actual conditions. So once you get into the design effort, where it's actually very site-specific, that's when you start identifying where you have issues that you cannot identify in a planning phase because you just haven't done enough of the upfront work that's necessary for a design process. And so now you're kind of seeing that, and then our estimates on the design is changing because the market changes and the time frame or scheduling of our procurements change. So that kind of starts to sequence everything else. So you start getting more refined estimates based on more real-time unit pricing or issues or market drivers and that kind of stuff. So our estimates are much more accurate than they were before, and that's simply because of where we are in a planning, design, construction phase.
So we should be able to have a much higher level of confidence than today.
We have a much higher level of confidence, but the outlier is the construction market.
Okay.
Where are you in that curve?
So back in 2012, when we had a $5.1 billion projection, what was the contingency that was built into that?
Was it about 30%?
30%.
So the FFGA, the 5.121 had 15% average contingency on that. Some construction contracts were given 20, professional services would be given 10.
On average,
it was 15%.
So that assumed, did that anticipate, the kind of construction cost increases that we're experiencing?
It did. So the FFGA, the basis of estimate, did identify that percentage, particularly on construction contracts. That 20% had about 7% what they would call
annual increase.
It was more of a design contingency. So on bid day, it gave a 7% variation to what we had as base costs. So that would kind of cover the market. The other 13% would be for the other stuff.
The escalation was carried.
But the escalation was already carried consistently.
So yeah. So right. when you do a projection 10, 15 years out, you typically carry a constant escalation over time to try and capture because you don't know where you're going to be in the cycle. So you try and capture a constant escalation over a period of time, and then you just hope that you're somewhere close based on where you are in the cycle.
So that escalation factor was 7%?
No, 4.5%.
4.5%.
4.5% was the actual escalation in our base costs.
Right. So in hindsight, it was clearly inadequate then?
Sure. Yep.
Yes.
As much as 7% inadequate. We're talking about 11%, 12% escalation today.
That's right. Correct. But and that's per annum today, right? I mean, it will start, that escalation will start to slow down as we enter into the recession part of our cycle. But even if we get into a negative escalation or de-escalation, whatever you want to call it, that amount is still small. It might go -1, -2, -3, but it quickly goes back up. So, which is why, even though you might capture a project in the down part of the cycle, over time, the cycle actually continues to go up rather than stay level and just cycle that way.
So the $7.9 billion figure, yeah, that factors in this escalation, projected escalation, as well as the anticipated de-escalation during the course of the remaining construction period.
I believe it assumes that we procure within the year for both for both airport and city center.
And lock in the price.
And lock in the price.
Yeah, but is that realistic to anticipate that we will actually lock in the price over the course of the next 8 years?
If we were, well, so cities, for airport, we will probably lock in that price within the next month or two, right? Once we make an award, so we'll lock that price in. City center, I mean, we need to try and capture in a point of time our best guess as to where we would, so that we could put a price to it, where we would procure it. And I believe we're assuming that we would procure something within the next year, so that we're still within this 12 to 15% construction escalation period. My guess is that we're going to start, it's going to start to slow down, but and the procurement is probably going to be out. So our numbers are just capturing our assumptions in a point in time.
But they are excuse me, but they do take into account that expectation for increases.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to secure the contract and lock in the price next year, it does take into account a 5 or 6 year contract duration. So we do escalate it a portion every year for a period of time.
Members, before we go on a round two on these questions, I have points that I want to clarify with Brennan and the staff, because I was the one who was before City Council on June 1st, and we're going to have to explain why our figures are this far off now. And just so that we have background on this, all of you received this just in the last meeting. This is effective March 16th. And it's really, it has the FFGA, and then it has the October 15th, and then it has March 16th. So Brennan, let's get this thing straight. The 7.967 is with a 15% contingency, and we don't know whether that's a P50 or P65, but we do know one thing. That is that the FTA doesn't like our contingency numbers, correct? They've always felt that our contingency numbers were too low. Because when we went before City Council, our contingency number was only $130 million. That's correct, right? When we asked City Council to give us a 2.1, what would be their 2.1?
The 130 was just the allocation of that they had to reallocate from the prior year. But it was the full amount that would have been necessary in the drawdown that we had approved by FTA.
So the problem as I see it is this. So the 6.827 figure that FTA is working off of, when they got to and said that our estimates were too low, they worked off of our figures, HART's figures of 6.827. Isn't that correct?
They worked off of our original estimates that were not, because we're doing our own separate independent cost estimate via our CE&I contract for the East.
I'm talking about what they worked off of in March. They worked off of our figures that resulted in the May 10th.
It was a previous cost
Right.
estimate that we provided them, which was much lower than it is today.
So given, just to give, because Colbert is new, let's look at these figures. Airport guideway, which is what we're talking about, starts in the FFGA, just so we all are on the same page, of $511,822,000 and some odd. Then in October, it goes to 673,440. And then in March, now October to March, October, November, December, January, February. 5 months later, we're at $820 million. Okay, this is just for airport. City Center, which is the other one, we're at 528,299 with the FFGA. Then in October, we're at $702 million and 720,000. Then in March, 5 months later, we're at $866 million. And I personally think those numbers are too low. Having said that, now we're going to go back and we're going to have to explain to council that we're at $7,967,000. Okay? And then we were just using these numbers, Brennan, June 1st. And now we're going to come back and we're going to say we have $7 billion, almost $8 billion. And we didn't make that disclosure to council. So what could have possibly have happened in that period of time when we're before city council telling them, this is what we need. We can do airport and we can do city center for this amount of money. Just give us flexibility so that we can actually use some of the contingency money to issue that quote, the bid, or award the bid so that Dan doesn't get in trouble. So Dan doesn't have to go to jail is really what we were trying to say, because he can't issue the contract. So to Colbert's question, right? And you went through this whole litany. We don't have the money. We do not have the money as projected to issue city center. Would that be a correct statement?
Not as currently planned, correct?
Right, not as currently planned.
Correct.
So whatever bid is out there, we can't, Dan doesn't have the money. He doesn't have the money to be able to say, okay, we can issue those contracts. Would that be a correct statement?
Yes.
Because if it wasn't a correct statement, we just wasted a whole lot of people's time watching to say, hey, we're at $8 billion ourselves, guys, right? The only reason we're going through this is because the FDA and the PMOC has told us, you guys are off. You don't have enough money. So that's why we're going to negotiate that. Wouldn't it be a correct statement?
Yes.
So we are clear as to why we're doing this. I don't want people to leave here with the impression that, oh no, we went through all of this, but we still have enough money to do this project. We don't have the money, or you guys should tell the board that we should tell the FDA and the PMOC, we have enough money. But we both know we don't have enough money. Is that correct?
Correct. So that slide was our attempt to demonstrate that there is a $1.1 billion shortfall.
Right.
Compared to project cost versus projected revenues.
And I want to be clear on that, because I don't want people to think, and especially the council and the mayor and the legislature, to think that there we go again, we just don't answer it straight. We don't have adequate funds. So yes, for people who want us to build it the way it's got to be built, then they have to find us, right now, as we sit here today, an additional potentially $1.2 billion, even by our own estimates, correct?
Correct.
So, and just so that we're clear, though we use a GET, and this is Corey's Kuliana, we use a GET rate of increase of 4.3. Even if we were to go to the 5.04, which we didn't use because the GET revenue increase was coming in lower, I think the delta is only possibly in a wonderful world situation we get more GET, maybe about $200 million. Would that
correct.
be a correct assessment?
That's correct.
So just so that everybody knows what the money picture looks like. So what we didn't put up there, because we said that alternatives are we build to budget, or we budget to build. The budget to build would mean simply where are you going to get an additional 1.2 billion? The mayor and the council chair has said there is no way we're going to increase real property tax. And though we may want to try, my friends at the legislature, and they have told me clearly, don't come back, but we can try to do that. But you're going to need another GET extension in order to possibly cover that amount of money. Isn't that correct? Wouldn't you agree that?
Yes.
If we don't have real property tax, you'd have to get a GET extension. I don't think you can do a GET extension. So, given that situation, we are here because we have to find out what is the best alternative. But also, so the public knows, it's not clear that this board is going to be the decision maker either. Because the FFGA is entered into between the city and county on Honolulu and HART as its agent. That's how the FFGA is written. I do not believe that it would be just our executive director who would go there. Because remember, members of the board, we have a problem because we have a governance structure issue as to who makes the decision for HART. But having said that, it's not necessarily HART that's going to make that decision. That's why we're looking on your last slide to some sort of task force or group. The problem is that August 7th deadline. We have to come up with something by August 7th. So unfortunately, we're not going to have all the good information that we should have in order to make this decision. Wouldn't that also be a correct statement?
More than likely, yes.
So we will have the opportunity to have input, and the reason why we're having this hearing is to tell the public this is where we're at. We don't know, and we could possibly make a recommendation, whatever that recommendation may be, the best we can say given the information we have, but that may not carry the day either, because what that would probably be is a situation where we're going to have to decide who is going to be the decision maker and who's actually going to negotiate with the FDA. Whether the city then says, HART, meaning Dan, you will be our agent again, or whether the city says, no, we're going to do it in some form or another. So have you heard from the FDA in any way that who they anticipate negotiating with on this?
No, we have not formally, but typically they have indicated that their normal protocol is to deal with the agency itself as the representative of the, I guess, the
Recipient,
grantee,
yeah.
the recipient.
And the grantee is the city and county of Honolulu.
Correct.
So the city and county of Honolulu could also just simply decide whoever the city and county of Honolulu is, whether council defines itself as the city and county of Honolulu as the policymaker, or the mayor, or a combination of both, they could decide to make that decision. So members, I just wanted to clarify where we were, how we're here, and really what it looks like. So I will open it up to round two. Michael?
Thank you. Brennan, I want to follow up on board members Matsumoto's question, because to me the tough part is going to be our confidence in the numbers. And so when I look at, or when I listen to the numbers that the chair read off back from the FFGA, which admittedly is a while back, but the 511 up to the 820, which we know is low, the 528 to the 866, which we suspect is low based on our recent ice. We think that's low. Then the escalation is clearly above the construction market escalation. Now there's a delta there. Mm-hmm. And what he's asking is what I'm interested in. What is that delta? Because that's what we can control. Putting out better specifications, better designs, better risk management, better cost containment. And those are the things that the FTA put in their letter. They didn't write a letter that was just like, you guys are doing everything right, now tell us what your plan is. They wrote a letter saying there's room for improvement. So what is that delta? If you take the construction escalation out, and we all assume that's going to happen, what is it that we can control so that we know what the reasonableness of these numbers are? Because I'm not even going to get close to 6.8 if that's what our revenue stream is, if I'm doubtful as to whether that number is accurate. I don't want to get close to that. Because the last thing we want to do is in 2022 be saying to the voters, we need more money. And that's the part that I can't figure out how we get that information by August 7th. Because you can't make a decision on what you can do if you don't have faith in your numbers. So we got to figure out what is it that we can control and do a better job at. And then I think we can have some confidence in the numbers. And if you can help us get there, that's what I'm looking for.
So there is some stuff that we have been doing as a part of our procurements to try and control some of the costs or get some cost reductions. We have issued addendums that address some of our offerers' concerns when they read through our general conditions and special provisions in terms of where they believe risk is assigned. And the more risk that the agency would take on, then there is a indication that prices would come down. So that's where much of our discussion has been of late, and that's why we issued an addendum for airport in conjunction with the BAFO. And then we will be also making an addendum for City Center. So we've had some initial conversations with the offerers for City Center as well to keep in line with some of the changes that we made as a part of airport to address some of their issues with the way that we provide in our contract documents. So there's some of that, and again, that's not going to be a significant reduction. I mean, maybe 5%.
Okay. The other thing, Brennan, I just want to clarify real quick is the contingency issue. Because I know under the original FFGA, that contingency was burned down and we only had 193 million left over at the end, right? Roughly 193 million at the end. In other words, it was anticipated that we would burn down through that contingency.
Correct. We'd have $193 million in leftover balance, ending fund balance, yes.
So I think a lot of times when people hear contingency, they think it's a bucket of money that is just sitting there and it's free and it's waiting for us if something goes horribly wrong to tap into. But the reality is many times we've already, without formally allocating it, we've allocated it to individual contracts. And for example, we've got change order claims. And we don't know what future change order claims are going to be on airport and city center. But I suspect, given the utility challenges on city center, if we award that contract, the change order claims could be significant. So I'm an advocate for more contingency versus less, because the history is we've just blown right through any contingency. So I hope when we go to the FTA, we give them a contingency number that doesn't mean we ever have to go back for more money, ever. Whatever it is we choose and decide to be our option, we just can't ever go back.
Right, and I think as a part of, I mean, our approach with the PMO and the FTA in terms of discussing with them our estimates versus theirs, it's not trying to convince them that they should let us use a lower contingency just for the sake of lowering our budget. It's that we have made our case in terms of the base construction estimate as to why we have more confidence in that estimate, which is why you could use a lower contingency rate.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah, so it's not an argument to just use a lower contingency just to lower our budget. That's not going to be our approach.
No, I understand. And Brennan, I do want to thank you and your staff for putting this together, because I know you did it in a very short time, and it took a lot of work on your part, but it's helpful to us, so thank you.
And which is why, Member Formby, I just want to make sure everyone is clear, especially in the public, the table you keep holding up, that when we look at, or when we're providing these numbers for the different terminus, it's really an arithmetic exercise, and it's not a true estimate of that specific. It's basically, we took a shortened guideway amount, and reduced the price, and then we took into account the cost of the station. So that's kind of how we did that estimate, and it was purely for discussion purposes only, just to kind of go through how this exercise would work.
Yeah, but now we've got to make a decision in a very short window, and we've got to have some way to quantify
absolutely
the risk associated with that number.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Members? Member Louis Kwan, do you have a further question?
No, thank you.
Terry?
Just intuitively looking at the options, I'm not real optimistic that any of them are going to pan out or make sense. And so then we're faced with the only obvious options, which are abandon the project or get more money. Getting more money means going back to the legislature and saying, please extend the general excise tax surcharge. The politicians aren't going to do it unless they got a feeling the taxpayers generally are supportive of that. So do we have the ability to do a poll, to poll the taxpayers and get their views on that? Because I think we should start preparing for that.
I don't think we have the ability, but I think maybe we could make a request to move Oahu forward. Dan, could you make a request to them?
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of an independent organization that's there to support rail. Maybe they've done it already. Who knows? They run independent of us. But Dan, maybe you can check on
I will do that.
them. Yeah, because I'm sure they're watching this carefully and also getting
Yeah.
very nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any further questions?
Yeah, just the other one is, in this June 6th letter from the FTA, they say that they urge us to engage a peer review with industry experts to recalibrate a critical path for project completion. Are we doing that?
Again, we just got the letter. We had done a peer review of the project a couple of years ago, and I don't think we've yet had a chance to talk about whether or not we take that recommendation, but it's always a good idea. For those who don't know, it's very common in the transit industry. We're not competitors because we're always complimenting folks, and we're not, my customers are not competing with the customers in another city kind of thing. And so that they tend to be very open. So you get people who will volunteer their time from other transit systems to come in who have dealt with similar problems. I think it would be a good idea, and I'd like to pursue it if the board's supportive of the idea.
Yeah.
Member Louis Kwan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'd like to ask a question from where we started. From where we started was this letter of June 6 from the Federal Transit Administration talking about a recovery plan. Can you tell us the parameters of the recovery plan as you understand it? That's language that's not familiar to me. What are they saying when they say a recovery plan?
In the kind of the simplest terms, it's a plan that will have us demonstrate maximum effort to achieve the goals that were in the original FFGA, but which now we can't, we're going to fall short. But we have to show that we're going to get as close as we can. So if we had said we projected we would have, in the revised estimates, 119,000 riders, and this was a comment that Board Member Lee made, ridership is top of their mind, absolutely. So if we come up with a plan that maximizes the total number of riders and benefits to those riders, that's going to be, as close to that number and as close to the benefits, that's what they're looking for. But then there's a competing point that has been made to me when I was in Washington a couple weeks ago meeting with the acting administrator and her staff about the recovery plan letter. That, we knew that it was going to be coming, and I asked the question. And so they made the very comment about ridership, but then the second thing is they made Director Formby's comment, which was, in competition with that, however, is you really have to be conservative in your numbers. We understand and see that the prices in Honolulu are the fastest rising construction costs in the United States and also the highest in the United States now. We're more expensive than New York City. And they also said, don't come back. In other words, if you need to reduce, they never talk about reducing the length of guideway stations in those exact words, but that's what they really mean. They mean that if you need to size the project smaller to fit your budget, as long as you can show you're trying to get the most number of riders possible, do that and then be conservative, because they would rather us, if I can just use this as an example, they'd rather us reduce by 10 stations and then find that we have additional money to add back a station or two than to say, well, we're going to reduce 6 stations and then come back and say, ooh, we actually can't afford that. We need to cut more. So they would rather have us be very conservative. So it's going to be a balancing act, I think, between showing that we are maximizing our ridership and benefit to the community, but also being conservative that we can actually build what we say we're going to build. And there isn't an actual template for it. I asked for that too. I said, is there a form or a way to do that? And there isn't one in particular, but I think that from the indications we've had from our conversations with the FTA, they're looking for the community to have this discussion, the policymakers make a decision, and then as your agent, we'd go back and we'd do the mechanics of writing this all up, doing the ridership analysis, doing the additional forecasting on costs, and then try to confirm to them that we think that we have a plan we can fund that maximizes or gets us as close as we could get to what the original plan was.
So, as I understand it, as I said early on, up to this point, that they've referenced a so-called recovery plan, their position has been, you've got to follow the provisions and the requirements in the full funding grant agreement of December 2012, and that's it. If you don't do that, give us back our money.
That's right.
But now they're saying, we recognize that they're making the assumption that, yes, the costs are beyond the availability of funds.
That, and I also think that they believe, as several board members have indicated, that given the challenge that it was to get the first extension, that they don't necessarily see it as highly likely that we could get a second extension so quickly of the general excise tax, and therefore they're willing to talk about at least moving the project. We can't stagnate, because every month we wait, $1 billion of costs becomes $10 million more expensive just because we waited, and that's Brendan's
And that's
point.
kind of, I think that's something that's fairly obvious, that we've got all these options, but all these options are going to take years. Going to take years, to most of them, unless we stop. Most of the options will take years to give life to. Just take, 2A. You got to do a supplemental EIS. You got to do re-engineering. It's just going to take forever. And so, realistically speaking, most of these options aren't available to us. That's kind of how I see it. Given the realities of construction costs continuing on, and us needing to make a decision. And so I don't know what the answer is, but I'm just trying to understand what are the rules of the game. But it sounds like the rules of the game from the FDA, when you talk about a recovery plan, is you've got a limited amount of money. With that limited amount of money, even though we've said that you needed to do an elevated guideway at 20 miles and 21 stations, we're going to back off of that position and come back to us with something that you think is doable. Based on the availability of money that's there.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
Howard, any follow-up questions?
No, I guess, I'm trying to think in my mind, what is it that we as a board are really tasked with at this point in time?
Right. Right now, it's not that necessarily true that the board will make the decision. So the reason why, and I also thank Brennan guys, because they did this as quickly as we had asked them to do it, because we felt that it was necessary for everyone to be aware of the situation that we were in, because FTA was they're here now, not if PMOC is here now. So we needed to bring it forward, and also for the public, because something like this will get out and people will know that we've got this problem. The other issue that we have is the fact that literally on June 1st, we went before City Council, and in the next meeting, we're going to talk about the budget, what the role of HART is on the budget, what do we do, what can we do, but the HART board anyway. But the other issue was, we also know that from the experience on June 1, we've got a major credibility issue with city council as well, because they feel that we, because they're looking at these numbers too. So they continue to tell me when I go before them, how could you tell us? Because remember now, this is just beginning of June, and it was in January that we were there with Bill 23 to basically say extend the GET. So they said, HART came in, told us 1.2 billion and not a penny more. So we have 300 and something million that we could put in a planning bucket, which they did. And now you're telling us you don't know how much it's going to be, and that was, March or so. And now when they hear this, it's going to be even more. They're going to say, well, how can you come and testify before us that we need a $2.1 billion additional CIP budget? And what happened? Why now? We don't even know that you can build everything that you asked us to authorize you to build. So I think the most important thing for us as a board and for primarily the public is to share the information as we received it. So this was actually in reaction to the fact that I think it was the Star Advertiser, as I see Marcel back there, who broke that the PMOC and the FDA, when they were here, said that it was going to have their estimates were 900 million to 1.2 billion more. So this all started in reaction to that. Let's look at the figure. If it gets to that point, we just don't have the GET income. What are we going to do? And then we also knew that the FDA had, in a conversation, I believe, with the mayor and council chair, said that come up with some proposal. The first sign of it in writing, I believe, was this letter. Isn't it true, Dan? This is the first sign of it in a letter, actually written about the recovery plan?
It is.
Yeah, but before that, they had mentioned it. So in anticipation of the fact that we would be put in this situation, meaning City County, Honolulu, HART, we said, okay, let's look at what does it mean to be in a recovery plan, and well, how would we comply with cutting the project or cutting the costs? And that's, so whether we play as a board, I'm sure, I'd like to think that people would welcome our opinion, but I don't necessarily know that. So just getting ahead of myself here, one of the issues is whether members of the HART board can even participate in a task force because of sunshine. So we have those issues as well. So do we have to form a pig among ourselves in order to participate? I mean, there's all these different types of issues that we have to contend with. So we're not quite sure how active a role we can play, but the one role we can play is we can bring it to the public so that they can get a sense as to where this project is.
I guess the way I look at it, though, is that the FTA, the council, and the legislature, in certain respects, are all the funders of this project. They have no direct control over the management of the project itself. That's tasked to HART. And so, I think that their expectation is probably that they're looking to this board to oversee that project management, which unfortunately we're not by charter empowered with real authority to do at this point. But nonetheless, faced with, I think, the deadlines that we're having to contend with, and this, history of, I guess, missteps in terms of projecting the costs of this project, and the loss of credibility that has now resulted with the funders, I think that it kind of behooves us to figure out, okay, what is our game plan to try to restore a level of credibility and confidence in whatever information and numbers that we give to the funders, so that they can say, okay, this is the problem that we're facing, that you guys are facing, and that you need to hurdle. And so, cutting aspects of the project to try to reduce the overall cost is one solution, of course, but also finding additional sources of funding is another way to deal with it. And so, but that's beyond our capability, right? But then we got to give them the level of confidence so that they can make the political decision as to whether or not they're willing to come up with the additional funding capacity to complete the project as originally planned. Yeah. So I kind of look at it that way, and so, you know, we got to go through this process to try to restore credibility. And so to me, you know, I guess this presentation, as well as the process of drilling down as to, okay, how do we come up with these numbers, and how reliable are these numbers, and what do these numbers really mean, I think are some things that we need to lay out with a level of clarity, so that there is no question later on as to, oh, why did you tell me this when it actually ends up being this, right?
And that's exactly I believe that the problem that we have, and that we have to earn that credibility, trust back, so to speak, because in the process, you know, we've lost it, and because people, if you're looking at these figures, right, how can you go from in March and to now, and because, you know, April, May, 2 months, I mean, how do you explain the change in that short period of time, and how do you explain or answer that question, what happened in between, right? What happened between March and of this year, not even last year, March of this year to now, that even you, HART, is saying that you're about 1.2 billion short of where you were in March, and that is the answer that we have to give. And we can attribute some to contingency, we can do all of that, but like Mike said, if contingency is only 760 million, which is a lot more than what we're carrying before, it still doesn't explain the rest. But we are in a position where we have to say, okay, now how do we move forward? So one thing is possibly the situation that we need to move forward on, and we don't have the ability to vote. We have the ability to continue this, but we would have to maybe explore in the next meeting, Cindy, whether we create a pig on this specific issue and get people to volunteer for that, and then be ready to participate in the decision making. Somebody's going to have to make this decision. It may not be us, because we do not have the authority to do it. But that's what I was going to ask my friend Brennan there. So Brennan, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? Which one would you pick? I don't want me, I mean, I'm not binding you to it. I just want to know. You guys live this project. So, you know, we can say, this is what we want, whatever, but the question is, which one would you pick? I think I know which one, you know. I think it's build the guideway as far as you can. But anyway, what's yours?
And again, a lot of this is going to depend on how we can choose different parts of this menu. Right? I would say that I agree with Member Formby in terms of what would be the most ideal or most important station to try somehow to get to, and that would be downtown station. If you look at the ridership, out of the 20 miles, 21 stations, downtown station is the number 3 highest ridership station, only second to Ala Moana, which is 21,000 boardings, and Pearl Highlands, which is 11,000. And Pearl Highlands is 11,000 primarily because you have the Pearl Highlands Transit Center and the parking garage that serves all of Central Oahu and North Shore. So if we can get somehow to downtown station in some fashion, whether it's deferral of a number of stations, including those that we have already contracted with, as well as looking at other avenues for some smaller amounts of additional revenue, I think the recommendation is probably going to come down that downtown is what we need to try to achieve for, strive for. I don't know how we get there. If you look at the numbers, the $7.5 billion, far over the 6.8. So I mean, because if you just start looking at where potentially what kind of functionality the guide, a rail system would have short of EVALE, you have a lot of problems. I mean, something terminating at Kapalama or Kalihi, I have a hard time seeing that make any form of sense.
And Brennan, for intermodal purposes, I think you and I both agree. Middle Street and downtown are the two best options if you're going to do anything in city center. Anything in between doesn't make a lot of sense.
Correct.
Downtown, you can get to Waikiki, you can get a lot of places with an intermodal transit center. And there's land. It's under the state, but there is land.
Yes.
So you would prefer that than the idea of, and as some put it, build the guideway to Ala Moana. Do everything you can to build the guideway to Ala Moana and just drop all the stations if you got to drop all the stations, because the stations are, with the exception of Pearl Highlands, are relatively inexpensive. That's why we don't save a lot of money with the stations, but notwithstanding downtown.
Correct. Well, and even if you look at, what was it, option 1, it's still 7.6, so we still can't afford even just building the guideway. But if I had to choose between the two, knowing that even if we were able to somehow build the guideway to Ala Moana and just have no stations in between, it's still not really functional. That's because you lose all of that ridership, both generation of trips as well as the destination that people are trying to get to. So I would rather have a functional system, something to downtown, than having the guideway.
Okay. I mean, that's what.
I mean, that's just my opinion.
No, that's all I'm asking for. But you guys lived the project, so you should. You have the best idea in terms of the ridership numbers and the functionality. And I know Member Formby has always looked at it in terms of how his buses interface.
Yes.
And I know that's why Kapalama doesn't work and other places don't work.
Because in any scenario other than the full 20 miles, in any scenario, it puts a greater stress on the bus service, because now you have to provide additional bus service to get people where they want to go.
Dan, do you have a preference? Just for the board's knowledge, do you have a preference?
Actually, I share the exact preference that Brennan just outlined. I think that you have to focus on functionality for ridership, knowing that Ala Moana is at this point not possible because of funding. Anything we could do to get to downtown or as close to it as possible is, to me, the best. I don't know if it's possible. It's going to take some very serious look at that first 15 miles of even what we're already building in terms of stations. But I know we've tasked staff to look at that, because that seems to be the best alternative. But we're in agreement on this one.
So Corey, if you could, we still have that infamous 10% out there. So how much would 10%, we're talking about with the 10%, the surcharge that the state retains. So if we were to go on bended knees and strawberry it and do whatever, and this is all Brennan's going to have to do this, so it's his knees that I'm talking about. So if we do that, what is the potential amount that can, if next session they say, okay, we'll give you, it's a whole gap. They're never going to give up the whole thing. So if you were to take like 8, 10, 3%, whatever, and they give back, what could we look at in terms of monies? Because I don't know if they'll give us a GET extension. I think not. So do we have any idea?
Yeah, Chair, I'd have to confirm with Mike McGrain. He's been closer to that number than I have, but I could definitely get you the answer next board meeting.
Yeah, and I think that's also something that we should put into this mix, that if we can, of course, a GET extension would do it, but I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think real property tax is going to happen either. So outside of that, the only other pile of money that might be available is if the legislature breaks loose some of that surcharge on the GET. So just to give the board an idea, and maybe we can get closer to wherever. And like I said, and just so the members of the public know, I'm not saying that this board is going to make the decision, because I don't believe that this board will be making the decision, but I'm hopeful that they'll ask at least some input. And I believe the staff will definitely have some input on this, so maybe that's something that you can add in and see what the FDA does. They could say that's another GET kind of thing, and we're not going to roll the dice with you guys on it.
Chair, I mean, if you just look at roughly 10 years, right, to 2027, starting in 2017, at roughly $300 million a year, that 10% amount, or 10% retention amounts to
About 300
somewhere between $200 to $300 million. Just ballpark.
And just for the exercise of the recovery plan, I did ask that question of the FTA. I said, well, in 2014, when we found that we had a shortfall projected, you didn't require a recovery plan. You let us go the year with the legislature and the governor and city council and so on. And they said, no, once we implement a recovery plan, that plan has to, you may want to be pursuing additional revenues, or you may want to add stations and things like that, but the recovery plan itself does have to be our plan with an assumption that we don't get any more money. So that's why this exercise is kind of real, because if we didn't get more, they want to know, what would you do with the $6.8 billion? Because I've told them, I said there is at least some interest in pursuing additional revenues, and they said that's fine, but that cannot be your answer this time. We're going to implement the recovery plan. We want to see what we would get for that money.
So you're saying that they're not willing to entertain the possibility that the legislature and the council might authorize a further extension of the GET?
They'd love to see it to fulfill the full obligation of the plan, but right now, because it's a recovery plan, and they're saying that you're in a mode where you need to say you have this much money, and we know it's short of what we project, or we're projecting it short of what you're going to need. We want to approve a revised plan based on what you have today.
But what does that get us from them?
They would allow us to move forward, knowing that we don't have the full amount of money, but they're still dedicating the full amount of their pledge of $1.55 billion.
So when would that be released?
Well, we've received a good chunk of it already, but with their pledge that we'll get all of it, then we can count that. The other alternative is that they could say, like if we said, hey, we don't want to do a recovery plan, and they put us in breach, they can, but under the terms of the contract, withhold remaining money that's still available to us, and also ask for money that they've already given us back. So in some ways, a recovery plan is, while it's an onerous task and it's a disappointing task for those of us who see the full project as a great benefit, it's a lot better than the alternative, which is breach.
So as I understand it then, this exercise in terms of coming up with the recovery plan is to basically give the FTA the basis on which to release the remaining funds of their commitment.
That's correct.
So what they want to know is, do we have a fallback plan that is satisfactory in their mind to release the $1.5 billion, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to, limit ourselves to that.
Absolutely not.
Once they accept the recovery plan?
Yes, if a recovery, let's assume that we came up with a plan that got us to downtown,
right,
with a significant number of other changes, and then they negotiate with us and they say, we approve this as a revised, it's actually an amendment to the plan. And that they're going to still leave the $1.55 billion. And then if at some point in the future we chose to seek additional funding through whatever means, and said we're going to add some stations, we're going to go all the way to Ala Moana, we want to go to UH Manoa, whatever it might be, that will be just on our decision as a community, as opposed to right now, as Board Member Louis Kwan has mentioned, up to this point until very recently, they kind of took a lawyerly approach, which was, you have a contract, you fulfill the obligations, or you're in breach, and we take our money back. They're meeting us sort of halfway in this point. I think, again, because they realize we've already taken a significant step as a community to try to make up the gap,
right,
but events have eclipsed that.
So basically, they're asking us to give them the basis on which to release the remaining funds. Right?
Yes.
And so we just have to come up with a satisfactory plan that would enable them to do that.
Yes.
Okay. But again, that doesn't mean that we have to necessarily implement that plan.
Correct.
Okay.
We just have to demonstrate.
Because I'm having a really hard time with any of the alternatives. Yeah.
Right.
It just, none of them make sense to me. Financially or from a functional standpoint, none of them make sense to me. And as hard a political decision as it may be to, complete the project, I mean, that's a decision that the people who are in the political positions need to make.
But then, wouldn't we have to implement at least to whatever we said? So for example,
yes.
if we said we can only afford to go to Middle Street, and we went to Middle Street, that doesn't preclude state monies or city monies being used to build it all the way to Ala-Moana.
That's right.
However, we have to at least show the good faith of building to where we said we're going to build.
That's
to
right.
get the money. Because part of the 6.8, and Corey, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the 1.55 from the feds.
Yes.
So we have their money in our 6.8.
Yes.
So we have to, whatever we propose, we have to do that.
Correct. But then if the day after, a year after,
You have the money to
we
do
can do
something.
more. Absolutely. There's no restriction. But there's again however, they really were stressing this, but they really don't want us to then amend the FFGA and come back and offer to do less. So if they do agree on whatever plan we come up with, we just need to make sure that there is sufficient contingency so that we don't have to come back and say, well, geez, we actually should have cut one more station or shortened the guideway by some additional amount because we're not going to be able to build even what we promised you in this amendment.
Yeah, but I want to be clear, though. That if we go back to them and tell them that our recovery plan is to stop at Middle Street, and they accept that, they'll release the funds, but that doesn't preclude us from, several months later telling them, well, the legislature has, given us the capacity to potentially fund the rest of it, and so we're going to, actually go forward.
Oh, and actually, even more than that, and I'd look to maybe Jesse and to Brennan on this one, but as I understand it too, well, we've done a lot of the homework on the environmental side and so on, but we'd actually also be out from under review of FTA on any of that additional work as well. If it's totally funded by the local jurisdiction, then while you have to follow certain federal and state regulations, the FTA oversight actually would not be in there at that point. So that you'd actually have some greater flexibility with any additional funding.
I wouldn't count on that.
Well, it's just, yeah.
No, I understand.
It puts you in a slightly different relationship with them.
Okay.
If that's right.
Anyone else? No? Anyone else? So members, we don't have a voting quorum, but we could continue with this, with the hearing and getting the information. So unless anyone has, Mr. Greenwood, did you want to make your final statement before we adjourn?
Mr. Formey asked about why we're seeing such a quick increase in the prices. And I just ask you to go back and look at history, referring to my comments earlier. Go back to 1992 when Ansaldo received the contract the last time. They got the contract on Wednesday. The following Monday, they could not do the UH leg. Friday, they couldn't do the Waikiki leg. The following week, they couldn't do the airport leg. And by the end of the month, it had gone from 1.8 billion to 5.6 billion without the legs. And this is a typical history of what Ansaldo's been doing. They got the contract on false pretenses because they knew, obviously, that they could not perform at the required price, which all the other competitors had given their bids at. again, in 1992, it was supposed to be 1.8 billion. This time it was supposed to be 3.8 billion. Bombardier had agreed to that price, but the city decided that they would eliminate them for a technicality that they put a double entendre into the contract, which no matter how you answered it, you lose. And so this is why I say that Ansaldo is lying to the people, because they never intended to make their initial contract price a reality, because they couldn't do it. But they told us, and they got the contracts based on that, and they eliminated the others who, as I say, Bombardier's train that they're building in Sao Paulo will move 10 times more people. It would actually make a difference in our traffic pattern. And so we really need to scrap Ansaldo and look at a different, either a Sumitomo or a Bombardier. They make Lear jets. This is a big company. They make all sorts of transportation equipment. And we're just, the only way that we can make it possible is to stop now. Also, again, as I said earlier, with the Iraq syndrome, they won the war, but there was no plan on what to do once they got it. And having worked on this project years ago, I know that it's possible for the city to actually make a profit if this is done properly. Because tourists will pay a premium to ride a monorail. Where, like in San Francisco, out-of-towners pay a premium to ride the cable car. Tourists would pay $30 or $40 for a 2 or 3 day ticket to ride the monorail. And so we're just, the whole thing is, in my opinion, we should stop now and start over again, looking at it from a totally different perspective.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Greenwood. Any other members of the public wish to? Yes, Barbara?
Thank you, Barbara Armatrout. Again, a member of Neighborhood Board 5, speaking as an individual. Thank you for this good talk and decision. And I do believe at least getting downtown is the original. Get people in town that live out in Kapolei. And if it can't go any further than that, the Waikiki Circulator bus can always get downtown. Mr. Formby knows about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Any questions, by the way? No. Somebody else out of a, yes, come forward.
Thanks again, very quickly. I appreciate it. Sir, you asked about polling. I just want to tell you, in 2008, which is the year we voted, not 2010, 2008, we already know, public thought the price was lower. We know everything that we were told is not true. But the most important thing we were told, and I have the surveys, happy to provide them, from Star Advertiser, well, it was Honolulu Advertiser at the time, Hawaii News Now, all the stations, all did polls. And they broke it down, why, if you're pro-rail, would you support and vote yes? Why, if you oppose, would you vote no? The people that voted yes, the overwhelming reason they voted yes was because they were promised reductions in traffic congestion. Reductions in traffic congestion. They didn't know until it was all over that it was going to be 57% worse with rail. They were told it was going to be better with rail. And that's why they voted. And it's not only just in 2008, the number was something like 50.6%. A bare majority of people voted yes. I can tell you, 2008 would have lost if people knew the truth. Not even the price, just the traffic congestion. The polls, they wanted traffic relief. They want this guy to get out of his car and ride it. Not me, but that guy. And so this talk about ridership, I'm not Slater. I'm not going to come in and tell you about how every other city got it wrong with ridership. I'm not going to revisit the Big Dig or any of these things. But they were promised traffic congestion reduction. We now know we're not going to get it. If that rail vote was again today, it would lose. So the idea of worrying about the ridership, that isn't what motivated voters. What motivated voters was traffic congestion relief ain't going to be delivered at Middle Street, it ain't going to be delivered in Waikiki, UH. You could build this into Hawaii Kai like some candidates want to. And I just wanted to share that because the numbers are there to look at. There might have been 1% of people who wanted to save the whales. That's why they wanted rail. 1% people, maybe because you could have more green space or something like that. Or maybe the price of oil or something. 90-some% of people who were on the yes side thought they were voting for traffic congestion relief, lower. Not this lie of reduced future traffic congestion to fool voters, but actual less. From 2008, you build this thing, it's going to be less. So I'm sorry if I've gone on, but I didn't want to share that. That's what people out there really think. You go back to them for more money, they know the truth now. You might be able to con the politicians, but you're not going to be able to con the voters, because we remember. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, members, if nothing further, I'm going to call this meeting adjourned.